All right. Hello there, United States history students. This is our second lecture on the industrial era of the late 19th century in American history. During the first part of this lecture on the industrial era, we spent a lot of time learning about the economic system of capitalism and how capitalism produced some of these incredibly wealthy entrepreneurs in the late 19th century. Men like Andrew Carnegie, John Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and how those individuals and several others helped to create a United States of America that was the greatest mass producing and wealthiest country on earth. Those handful of great businessmen placed the United States of America on a track to becoming the economic powerhouse of the 20th century. And that is a very important part of the American story. Another important part of the American story is what we're going to focus on today. And that is the story of the masses of Americans and how life was changing significantly for them. In the late 19th century, society was changing, America was changing. It was the cities where men were able to find jobs and no longer the farms. So there was this great demographic shift from families moving from the countryside into the cities. And cities like Chicago, Pittsburgh, New York, that we'll learn about, became these booming metropolises. And that changed the culture of the United States. Also, as the United States of America became the wealthiest country in the world, that wealth was certainly not shared evenly by all. So in this lecture, we'll learn a little bit about the economic forces that created a handful of super rich, as well as a growing number of people living in poverty in the late 19th century, and then how the working class responded. These things are also a very important part of the American story, and they too help us to understand who we are today. Okay, this is big stuff. Let's get to it. Once again, I'm going to take us all the way back to the year 1865 and the end of the Civil War. I keep going back to this moment of history as really the beginning, the birth of modern American history. So in terms of labor, the Civil War was not a good thing. There were a great many men killed during the American Civil War. How many men were killed during the American Civil War? Well, that number's still being tallied, but it was at least 640,000 men. 640,000 men, well over 500,000. And estimates today are placing that number closer and closer to approximately 750,000. But suffice it to say, for this lecture, we lost a whole bunch of men, and young men who were workers. So now, after the war is over, we literally have a lack of men in the United States of America. And this is at the same time that America begins industrializing. We've got trains, we've got factories, we've got oil wells and oil refineries. We're starting to develop steel within the next decade. We're working on the Transcontinental Railroad. We're spreading westward. All these things are happening, and there are not enough men to do the job. So, if we need workers, and there aren't enough workers here in the United States of America, what do you think our federal government is going to do? Well, if you're thinking to yourself, open the doors of the United States of America and invite other people into our country to live and to work, why, you would be correct. From the middle of the 1860s until the middle of the 1920s, it was a boom time for immigration into the United States of America. For the most part, we opened up our doors and we welcomed people into our country during these decades. Now, we will learn this was not universal. There were some people that we wanted in and other people we tried to keep out. There is a controversial legacy to the history of immigration into the United States of America in the late 19th and early 20th century, and we will learn about this. But overwhelmingly, the United States of America opened its arms to immigrants in the late 19th century. In fact, there's probably a pretty good chance, a significant chance, that one of your ancestors came to the United States of America during this time period. Take me, for example. My great-great-grandparents, Anna and Rudolph Endress, they emigrated here to the United States in the 1880s. That couple would have been one of many couples, many families that were coming over during this time period. They may have been on one of those one of those crowded boats that looks like the one you're looking at right now. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more specifically about the immigrant experience of the late 19th century. And I'm going to start with our East Coast first, and then I'll talk about our West Coast. So specifically, I'm going to talk about New York City and the immigrants coming into New York City in the late 19th century. Most of the immigrants who came into New York City in the late 19th century, so they were immigrating in to our East Coast, they came primarily from Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe. So this was creating a more multicultural United States of America because prior to the Civil War, most of the immigrants coming into our eastern coast were coming from Western Europe and especially the British Isles. So Britain, Scotland, Ireland, France, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands. That's where most of the immigrants were coming from prior to the American Civil War. I guess I should also very much include in this group the Africans that were imported against their will as slaves that came into the United States of America prior to the Civil War. And so now after the Civil War, in the late 19th century, we've got these new groups that are coming from, again, Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe. So Italians, Poles, Russians, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, more Germans, Austrians, etc. And this is making the United States of America as a whole, and New York City specifically, a very multicultural and diverse place. In the year 1900, approximately 1/5 of New Yorkers, 20% of New Yorkers, did not speak English. Now, why were all these people coming to the United States of America? Well, each immigrant has his or her own individual story. But overall, there were push factors and there were pull factors. Consider the push factors to be that most of these people are oppressed people who do not come from a place where they can live freely. These people are not coming from republics. They are not coming from democracies. And so they don't have the opportunity for any type of economic or social advancement. I mean, if your parents were peasants in Austria, chances are you're going to grow up a peasant in Austria, and so are your kids, and you're really going to have no opportunity for advancement. So the United States of America represents for you an opportunity to create a new life and hopefully a better life. So many of these immigrants came over here on a ship with next to nothing. And so many of them had this hope for this new life. It would have been an incredibly daring and bold thing to be any one of these people that you see on this ship. This was a gamble that they were making with their lives to improve their lives and the lives of their children and grandchildren and all of their descendants. It would have been an act of hope to get on one of these ships. Now, one very important group that's coming over in large numbers at this point in time in history from mostly Eastern Europe were people of the Jewish faith. Because Jews, in particular the areas today of Poland and Russia, the Jews there were experiencing violent acts of terrorism against them. These were known as pogroms. Literally, these Jews were living in small villages. They tended not to integrate themselves into communities of other non-Jewish people. And sometimes they would their villages would literally get attacked. So in Russia, there was a group called the Cossacks, and the Cossacks would raid these Jewish villages. And these acts of terrorism were called pogroms. And the Jews would be beaten up, sometimes tortured, sometimes killed. And who could live like that? And eventually there's just this feeling, nothing could be worse than this. We got to get out of here. Where do we go? Many Jews migrated westward to places like France and Germany, but some of them got on a boat and came to the United States of America. Okay, so let's talk about this journey. And let's talk about what these people went through in order to become an American citizen in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The boat ride over from Europe would have taken about 2 weeks, and although there were around 200 points of entry where an immigrant could come into the United States of America at this time, by far the most popular place to enter into the United States of America was the place where most of the ships went, which was New York City. Or I guess to be more precise, New York Harbor, since most of the immigrants are actually going to be processed through New Jersey. And of course, the western side of New York Harbor is New Jersey, not technically New York City. All right, so as these immigrants would make their 2-week voyage into New York Harbor, this would be one of the very first things that they saw. Here is the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty is probably the single most recognizable icon of the United States of America. The Statue of Liberty was, I think most of you may know this, a gift from the country of France for our centennial in the year 1876. It actually took a full 10 years to get the money together to piece the different parts of the Statue of Liberty together and create a pedestal for it and prop it up in New York Harbor. So it actually didn't get erected like you see here until the year 1886. And there was actually another big centennial for its, or another big centennial celebration for its construction in 1986. But I digress. The Statue of Liberty goes up, as you see it here, in the year 1886. Here she is, Lady Liberty, a goddess, holding up a beacon of light and a tablet, and on the tablet it says July 4th, 1776, our birthday. Now, what exactly is this Statue of Liberty supposed to represent? Well, liberty and freedom, of course, but liberty and freedom for whom? In the 1880s, there were actually multiple interpretations of the Statue of Liberty in terms of what Lady Liberty represented for the United States of America. Just like back then and today, different people have different ideas about what it means to be an American. And in the 1880s, these different ideas were superimposed upon this image. It wasn't until a poem was written to raise money to get this statue put together and up in New York Harbor that there was any sort of agreed upon idea of what Lady Liberty, the Statue of Liberty, was to represent. And we will talk about that poem here in just a few minutes. All right, but for now, let's go back to the immigrants on the boat. They've been on a boat for 2 weeks, most of them down in steerage. They are in cramped quarters, most likely, because there were so many people wanting to come over to the United States of America, and there weren't too many regulations in terms of how many people you could pack into a boat at that time. There were many people who came over in really cramped quarters. It was a tough 2 weeks. But when you finally found your way into New York Harbor, your boat would anchor down into New York Harbor. You wouldn't dock just yet. You would anchor down in New York Harbor so that officials could boat over to you to inspect the ship and all the passengers on the ship before you went into dock. Now, what's interesting is who these officials are. Prior to the 1880s, they were state officials. Becoming an American citizen was done by the states, not by the federal government. But in the 1880s, that all began to change because so many immigrants were coming in that the federal government wanted to standardize the process by which immigrants became American citizens. So starting in the 1880s, these federal officials were coming over from the New Jersey side of New York Harbor. They would get on the boat, and the first thing they would do is go to the rich people in first and second class. Now, most of the rich people aren't immigrants because if they have money, they probably aren't moving from one country to another. So they're here visiting or they're returning from a visit, and these federal officials will just sort of check them out, confirm who they are, and then these individuals will be the first to go on shore. And then the federal officials go down into steerage, third class, the common people. And this is when the processing would begin. The United States federal officials would be walking around among the immigrants with a large piece of chalk. These federal officials have one primary concern, and that is health. They didn't want new diseases entering into the United States of America. So with these large pieces of chalk, they would mark your clothing. So if you were sick or injured in a particular way, or if they thought that you had some sort of cognitive or mental disability, they would make the appropriate insignia by writing it on chalk, most likely on the lapel of your jacket. They were pretty concerned about a particular eye disease that was infectious and contagious at this point in time in history. And so they spent a lot of time looking at eyes. But then after these federal officials were done on the boat, they got back on their boat and went back to the western shore of New Jersey, while you, an immigrant, waited on your boat to be processed here. On the western side of New York Harbor, in what is technically New Jersey, Sitting on 27 acres is this huge immigrant processing station, which becomes probably the most famous immigrant processing station in American history. And it was, during its existence, the busiest international border crossing in the world. This is, of course, Ellis Island. Now, Ellis Island was extraordinarily busy, and sometimes you'd have to wait on your boat for, I kid you not, a couple of days while you waited for the boat to get the opportunity to go up to dock so that you could get off. Think of it a lot like a busy airport today. You know, if you're in a busy airport, you can't just get on the plane and the plane takes off. Sometimes that plane has to wait in line for its turn to take off. It's sort of the same type of thing in New York Harbor with the boats carrying immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. You had to wait your turn, and I can only imagine that the excitement and the nerves of just waiting to get your chance to go to Ellis Island to get processed to become an American citizen. But eventually it would happen and your boat would get called and you'd go to Ellis Island. And here come some immigrants. Again, brave souls all. They're leaving a life behind to start a new life in an unknown land of the United States of America. They're carrying everything they own at this point in time in their life. Some of them probably have very little money. I would say most of them have very little money. But they get down off the gangplank off their boat. They're finally on dry land for the first time in weeks, and they carry their baggage into the Ellis Island processing station. As they walked into the station, their bags would be tagged, but they would have to put their bags down for inspection, and then they would be expected to walk upstairs into the Great Hall for processing. Now, it was very important that they walked upstairs. Ellis Island was designed for this in particular, because at the top of the stairs, doctors would be looking down. And because the immigrants would have to walk up the stairs, it would enable the doctors to more easily be able to identify somebody with a disability. And here I mean specifically a physical disability, because walking upstairs can be difficult if you have a physical disability. And then once at the top of the stairs, these doctors would then mark anybody identified with a physical disability with chalk on their clothes. And then at the top of the stairs, the very first thing that would happen would be a brief, and I mean very brief, medical inspection. When I say a brief medical inspection, I mean it would last between 10 and 30 seconds, and sometimes less than that. These first round of nurses would just essentially be giving you a once over, just to make sure that you looked healthy. Your eyes, your mouth, your skin, your physical body, like your arms and your legs, that all of that looked good. Now, I don't know the exact percentages here. I couldn't find it. But most of the people cleared this initial inspection fairly easily. For the minority, and it was probably a significant minority, I would guess between 20 to 30%, they would go in for a more detailed medical inspection, like you see here in this particular image. And again, eye inspections were particularly frequent. Many people are like me in particular, and their eyes are very sensitive. They don't like their eyes being touched. I can only assume this was a very uncomfortable examination. But then once you made it through this medical examination, then you got to go into the Great Hall. This is probably the most famous room in all of Ellis Island. And here it is back in the day, back 100 years ago, or probably more than 100 years ago. It was modeled after a train station because that was the only type of building that people were familiar with in the late 19th century that was used to accommodating or processing thousands of people a day. And so Ellis Island looks and feels a lot like a train station. Now, if you look at this picture back then, there are all these benches and gates lined up to essentially corral people in a particular place. Today, when you go to visit Ellis Island, most of those benches and all those gates and such are removed, and it's really just a great hall. And you can walk around it fairly freely. So here's one picture of Ellis Island. Here's another picture of the Great Hall, which I like because they have the American flag unfurled in this particular picture. And I can't tell precisely, but it looks like where the flag is here, it's behind that where you come up the staircase initially, back up from the boats. It's right around there in the back. And then you go into the medical exams, and then afterward you come back out into the Great Hall, and you take your seat and you'd wait for processing. And then this becomes the bureaucratic processing. This is a very famous picture of Ellis Island. You see the masses of hopeful immigrants waiting for their turn to step up to become processed. And by processed, I mean to become a citizen of the United States of America. It had to be extraordinarily scary and extraordinarily exciting. I often wonder about this guy who we see here in the foreground who's looking, who's in this situation right now. He's being processed to become an American citizen, and somebody's taking his picture. And I wonder what he's thinking as he's looking at the photographer. He's probably thinking, why are you taking my picture right now? Leave me alone. I'm stressed out enough. Right behind the glass windows there in the background, that looks out into New York Harbor. So you could see the Statue of Liberty outside of those windows back then and of course still today. Okay, so what are they going through as they're being processed right here? Well, mostly they're being asked to confirm information that they gave before they boarded the boat. So, information such as, what is your name? How much money do you have? What country did you come from? What is your race? And that's interesting. They asked both what country you came from and what your race is. They specifically wanted to know your ethnicity. They wanted to know if you had any family in the United States of America and if you had a job lined up in the United States of America. So there were a couple of purposes for this processing. The first was to, as you're becoming an American citizen, to get the correct information on who you are, get your name, where you came from, etc. But of course, the other purpose was to make sure you are in no way, shape, or form a threat to the United States of America, that you're not coming here with some sort of ill intent. When you were processed, there were many interpreters there. So even if you did not speak English, that should not have been a deterrent from you getting in. So if you were, let's just say, for example, Hungarian, and you stepped up to be processed and they realized that you were Hungarian, they would call the Hungarian interpreter up to help process you. So of all these individuals who stepped up for the bureaucratic processing, 80% of them will move on to exit Ellis Island and become an American citizen. However, for 20% of them, they would be interrogated. To be interrogated, there would have to have been something suspicious about your paperwork, about who you said you were, where you came from, what your purpose was for being in the United States of America. And so you would have to sit, like you see this man here, in front of 3 officials who would work for the United States Department of Justice, and you would have to answer whatever questions they had for you about who you are, where you came from, why you are entering into the United States of America. I can only imagine that this too would be a very emotionally difficult seat to be sitting in. It'd be tough to stand and sit in front of these 3 individuals who are essentially your judges. Here is that interrogation room today. It's preserved by the National Park Service. Okay, but once you make it through all this, then you're done. You will receive your immigration papers. You will have your name written in English, or I guess by that I mean your name written using our Latin alphabet. And hopefully the government official at Ellis Island spelled it properly. And now you get to exit Ellis Island and go, well, first you'd exit into New Jersey, but most likely will eventually end up in the teeming streets of New York City. You might end up here, the Lower East Side of Manhattan. This is most likely where you'd end up if you were Jewish, because there was a large Jewish community here in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And congratulations, you're an American. Good luck. So that is, in general, what it was like to be processed at Ellis Island. Here's some more interesting information about Ellis Island. So if you remember, originally processing immigrants was something that states did. It wasn't until the 1880s that the federal government, under the Department of Justice, began processing immigrants. So Ellis Island was not constructed and it did not open until the year 1892, and it opened in early January 1892. It was the busiest border crossing in the world from that time, 1892, all the way up until 1925. It did not close down in the year 1925, but at the time, the president, Calvin Coolidge, he pressed Congress to pass legislation to begin limiting the number of immigrants coming into the United States of America. By the time we get to the 1920s, we'll learn about how many Americans started looking at immigrants as a threat. That immigrants weren't coming here because they were following an American dream, but because they were threatening the United States of America. That was in the year 1925. It didn't close down officially until the year 1954. And that is when the last immigrants were processed on Ellis Island. And then that building pretty much lay dormant for 30 years It wasn't until the 1980s that restoration began, and then it became a national park site and opened as a place you could visit in the year 1990. Of all of the Americans that are alive today, of all of the Americans that are here living in the United States today, 40% of them have an ancestor that was processed through Ellis Island, which means that there could be a good chance that you have an ancestor that was processed in Ellis Island, in which case, Ellis Island is a great place to visit someday. You can look up your ancestor in one of their many digital archives, and you can think about what a bold and daring journey they must have gone through. Okay, but how many of them of these immigrants made it into the United States of America, and how many of them got turned away? Well, overall, the odds were significantly in your favor to becoming an American citizen. Only 2% of the immigrants who came into Ellis Island were eventually sent back to their home country. And the United States of America paid for their fare back to Europe. So only 2% were turned away. And of those that were processed and became an American citizen, it happened within 6 hours. So from getting off the boat into getting into New Jersey, leaving Ellis Island, 6 hours. Now, it wasn't like that for everybody. Some people, especially people who were sick from the boat ride over, or if they did have one of these awful eye diseases, they might be held in Ellis Island for days, sometimes months, but those were certainly the exceptions. I think it would be mind-boggling for most people trying to immigrate to the United States of America today to know that at the dawn of the 20th century, they could have been processed within 6 hours of entering the country to become an American citizen. That is an extraordinarily fast and speedy process. No immigrant becomes an American citizen so fast today. It is much more difficult to become an American citizen today. There is a lot more bureaucracy. And this is a very important story in our country's heritage. This wave of immigration in the late 19th and early 20th century, making the United States of America this multicultural melting pot. But just because you were processed so quickly doesn't mean life was necessarily easy for you once you became an American city and you hit the streets of New York City. Once you became an American citizen and hit the streets of New York City. I mean, you still have to get a job. You still have to find a place to live. A lot of these immigrants had families to take care of. How are you going to do it? And so we have an important term in United States history to describe where many of these immigrants first found a place to live. A tenement was one of the many cheaply constructed apartment buildings that went up in New York City and other booming cities at this time, like Chicago, Pittsburgh. It was in these tenements where many immigrants came to live. Typically, because these immigrants were poor, especially at first, they tended to crowd together in one small tenement apartment. It would not be uncommon to be sleeping in the same room with all your brothers and sisters and parents in one of these tenements. These tenements were notoriously poorly ventilated, and there weren't a lot of laws about the construction of apartments at this time. So things like fire escapes and doors that open outward, these things aren't standardized yet. So even if there is, for example, a fire escape, it probably is very poorly constructed with some cheap iron. So here's an image of a tenement. It's obviously a much more recent image. Here's an image from the late 19th century or early 20th century. Here's a very famous photograph of an immigrant family living in a tenement. This photograph was taken by a photographer in New York City named Jacob Riis. We will learn more about him in a future lecture. But here we have one of these brave immigrant families trying to make a better life for themselves. They likely have a story about what they left behind, why they're here in the United States of America. They likely aren't living as comfortably as you and me today. But I personally tend to draw a lot of inspiration from images like this, the images of immigrants that came over at this time, willing to work so hard to be an American because they want opportunity. They want a better life for themselves and their family, for their kids and their grandkids. This is why nearly everyone who's immigrated to the United States of America has come to the United States of America, from the Pilgrims in 1620 through to today. And now's when I go back to this. The country of France had made the Statue of Liberty and shipped it over to the United States in pieces for our birthday in the year 1876, when our country turned 100 years old. But the Statue of Liberty stood in pieces in New York City for nearly 10 years So Lady Liberty's head would be here, the torch would be over there. People could walk up to these things and see them, but the state of New York didn't have the money to put this thing up. The people of New York and their elected representatives didn't know if this was a wise use of taxpayer dollars, putting this thing up. Because what did it mean? So for 10 years, we were like, okay, thanks, France, but we're not sure that we collectively see the value of putting this thing up yet. And what does Lady Liberty mean? One interpretation is she's protecting us. She's protecting the liberty and freedom of the people in the United States of America. She's sort of like a sentry, a guard, protecting the safety of the people within by keeping foreign threats out. And that was one important interpretation. But in the early 1880s, when there was a fundraising effort going on to construct the pedestal upon which Lady Liberty would stand, that would be the gigantic rock structure that you see the statue resting upon here in this picture. A New York resident, a Jewish American woman, stepped forward to write a poem. This would be a poem that would be used to describe what Lady Liberty stands for. It would be a poem that could be circulated by newspapers around the United States of America so that people would read this poem, be moved by the poem and what Lady Liberty was supposed to signify, and therefore contribute just a few dollars for the construction of the pedestal. Now, in terms of a poem that was written as a fundraising effort, it's probably the most famous in American history. The Jewish American poet, her name was Emma Lazarus. She's a New Yorker. A lot of people just assume that she was one of the many Jewish families that was coming from Eastern Europe at the time, but in fact she was not. She actually has ancestry that goes back before the American Revolution in American history. So her family had been Jewish, they'd been Americans for generations. The poem that she wrote was called The New Colossus. The original Colossus was a giant statue of a god guarding a harbor in ancient Greece. So Emma Lazarus identifies the Statue of Liberty as the new Colossus. Her poem is relatively short. What you're looking at here is the bronze plaque upon which the poem was engraved, and it was placed on the pedestal where it still is today at the base of the Statue of Liberty because of the funds that this poem was able to garner, because of what this poem inspired in the American people to contribute money to the construction of the pedestal. The Statue of Liberty was able to go up, and we have one of the most eloquent expressions of the American identity. This is a poem that celebrates democracy. It is a poem that celebrates everybody. It doesn't matter who you are or where you came from. Welcome to the United States of America. You're an American. We do not turn you away. We welcome you. So her poem goes. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sun-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her wild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep ancient lands your storied pomp, cries she, with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Emma Lazarus, perhaps one of the most famous of American poets, and really famous for one poem. This is it. And in this one poem, she puts to words a very important part of the American experience and the overall American identity. Okay, so this so far has been all about the immigrants coming into New York City. What about the other coast of the United States of America? Well, now this is a very different type of story. The primary port of entry on the east coast of the United States of America was Ellis Island. On the west coast in San Francisco Bay, there was Angel Island. Here is a picture of Angel Island when it was operational between the years of 1910 and 1940. Angel Island, just like Ellis Island, was an immigration processing station. There were thousands of people who came through Angel Island. Ships came to Angel Island from the west coast of South America and Central America, India, Southeast Asia, Russia, Japan, and China. Now, we learned about how on Ellis Island, for the majority of the people who came through to be processed there, their experience lasted approximately half a day, 6 hours from entrance to exit. That tended not to be the case at Angel Island, and especially in particular for the Chinese immigrants into the United States of America, into the San Francisco Bay area here at Angel Island. And so I want to spend a little bit of time here talking about the Chinese American experience of the late 19th and 20th centuries. So let's begin here. In the year 1848, gold was discovered in California, principally around the San Francisco area. This sparked the 1849 gold rush. Thousands of people swarmed to the San Francisco Bay Area in hopes of striking it big. One of the individuals who did get lucky enough to strike it big was a man by the name of Leland Stanford, who would later go on to become the governor of California, and Stanford University in the San Francisco Bay Area is named after Leland Stanford. This gold rush was a boom to San Francisco, California, which is why the professional football team of San Francisco, the San Francisco 49ers, well, this is how they got their name, from the 49 gold rush. Now, it wasn't just Americans traveling from the east to California who were in search of gold and striking it and making it big. News of what was called Gold Mountain spread across the Pacific to China as well. And China in 1849 was descending into civil war. China in the 1850s and into the 1860s was a very scary, very bloody, very dangerous place to be. So many Chinese began emigrating into California. Many of them with hopes of, if not striking it big in the gold rush, at least having a better life than the one they had in China. Now, after the gold rush boom was done in the 1850s, many of the Chinese immigrants began working on the railroads, and in particular the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1860s. And we've already learned about in a previous lecture the vital role that Chinese immigrants played in the construction of the Central Pacific portion of the Transcontinental Railroad. So after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad and the establishment of more and more Chinese families in the city of San Francisco, many white Americans began perceiving the Chinese Americans as being a threat. This, I don't know of any other way of talking about it, it was racism pure and simple. The Chinese simply weren't white. They came from a different ethnic background. They had a different culture. They had a very different language that wasn't based on the Latin alphabet. And there was an actual movement called the Chinese Must Go movement. And groups of white men would band together like a gang, and they would go into Chinese neighborhoods and they would beat up and harass people of Chinese descent, simply trying to intimidate them and scare them out. This led to the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was federal legislation that prevented any individual of Chinese descent from entering into and becoming an American citizen. This actually built upon a previous piece of legislation from the 1870s that stopped all Chinese women from entering into the United States of America. The idea there was, it was thought that a lot of the Chinese men who came over would eventually return home to China, and many people felt that that was okay. that Chinese men would come here as laborers and then eventually leave. But when women started coming over, then there was the idea that, okay, these men are going to marry these women, they're going to have families, and they're going to be here forever. They're going to be Americans. And many white Americans, really just out of a purely racist mindset, which they had at the time, they're like, okay, they first banned women, and that happened in 1775. And then in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which so far in American history is the one and only piece of legislation that specifically targets a national group, an ethnic group, the Chinese, and says, you are not allowed to come into our country. You are not allowed to immigrate to our country. You're not allowed to become an American citizen simply based upon your national or ethnic heritage. Now, the Chinese Exclusion Act passed in the year 1882. It does not technically kick Chinese or Americans of Chinese descent out of the United States of America. The law doesn't do that. However, the law inspired a lot of these groups of racist guys to ratchet up their harassment of the Chinese, which led to, in the late 1880s, multiple massacres of Chinese Americans. Now, this law will remain in place until World War II in the 1940s. And it was finally overturned during World War II in the 1940s because the United States of America was allied with China during World War II. They were our friend, and so we started engaging in more diplomatic, positive relationships with China. But then that brings us to the story of Angel Island. There were many Americans of Chinese descent who were here in the United States of America and then who left and were trying to come back in. Many of the Chinese people who were trying to make it into the United States of America were immigrants leaving horrible conditions. And they were lucky enough to have family already living in the United States of America. And these family members were sponsoring them to help get them into the United States of America so that they could have a better life. This was a difficult thing to do. It involved a lot of bureaucracy given the Chinese Exclusion Act. So, if you were one of these Chinese immigrants who came to Angel Island, chances are probably really good that you have next to nothing in terms of money. You probably would barely have enough to buy food during the trip over, because if you had resources, you probably aren't going to try to daringly make it into the United States of America. Once you got off the boat and into Angel Island, then, very similar to Ellis Island, you went through a medical examination. And these medical examinations were much more thorough, and they happened multiple times. The medical examiners are looking for a problem to block your entry into the United States of America. After this, there would be multiple interrogation sessions where you would speak one-on-one with a government representative from the Department of Justice. This probably would feel a lot like a police interrogation. Who are you? What is your family connection? Why do you want to come into the United States of America? And you would experience multiple examinations like this over the course of multiple days. So if you went to Ellis Island in New York Harbor, you would likely process within 6 hours. At Angel Island in San Francisco, the process lasted anywhere from 6 days to, in many cases, several months, like about 3 months. And then in some rare cases, people were held there for over a year. So because so many people were detained at Angel Island essentially became a de facto prison. And it sort of ran like a prison too. You had your bunk, you lived in close quarters, you had a limited amount of space to put your stuff. You had specific times in which you were allowed to exercise and in which meals were provided for you. Here is an image of, the image that you're looking at right now are obviously bunks where people would sleep. And here's an image of a holding pen, families that have come in that are awaiting a bureaucratic examination. Now, so it's at least nice to say that the majority of people who came from China to get into the United States of America still made it in, but it was not the 98% that you had in Ellis Island. At Angel Island, the statistics range between 70 and 80% of the people who came to Angel Island, of the Chinese that came to Angel Island, entered into the United States of America. but the process was far more grueling. And if you think about the whole experience from the perspective of the federal workers who work for the Department of Justice, who ran both Ellis Island and Angel Island, they were under different pressures too. So in Ellis Island, there was really this desire to process the immigrants, to get them in, to help them. They didn't have a lot of motive to stop somebody from coming into the United States of America. They wanted to keep America safe. They want to make sure that people didn't come in with diseases. So if you were held at Ellis Island for like medical reasons, that was just to get you healthy, and you might, be essentially in quarantine in Ellis Island for a few days. But then once you got healthy, then you were released and you became an American citizen. It was the rare exception, the 2% of the people that were placed on boats and sent back home. But at Angel Island, it was a lot more difficult, even if you did want to help the Chinese immigrants coming in. Because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, it was very difficult to process these immigrants. You had to ensure that they had a sponsor in the United States of America, that their paperwork was online, that these people were actually related. So chances are their family would have to come in from San Francisco or from wherever. You'd have to talk with them. I mean, it was a long process and a horrible ordeal, and people suffered a lot emotionally. But you couldn't break down. You couldn't show weakness, because if you broke down and you showed weakness, if you cried about the situation, well, then maybe you're mentally unfit, and and the authorities have reasons to send you back to China. But in the end, approximately 70 to 80% of the Chinese immigrants who went through Angel Island were eventually processed and got into the United States of America. But they did have to suffer through that awful ordeal. Okay, so now Angel Island. It was operational in terms of processing immigrants from 1910 to 1940, so exactly 30 years. And then for the next 30 years, it sits dormant from 1940 to 1970. And in 1970, the state of California is getting ready to tear it down until a California park ranger, a man by the name of Alexander Weiss, goes in to the old empty building. And he found stuff. As Alexander Weiss walked into the rooms where Chinese immigrants were being held for days, months sometimes, going through this awful ordeal of being processed, he found that they wrote on the walls. There are all these Chinese inscriptions that Alexander Weiss can't read. So he begins bringing people in who can read Chinese. And they discover that what this Chinese writing is on the walls of Angel Island is poetry. Poetry is it's an important part of any culture's tradition, although today in the 21st century, with all of our various forms of entertainment, poetry doesn't seem to rank as high with the masses anymore. But it did for many Americans in the 19th century, and in the 20th century, in China, it was still very much a very important part of their educational curriculum. The Chinese are familiar with poetry. And what was discovered was, while these Chinese were enduring the hardship of this lengthy processing and essentially imprisoned on Angel Island, they began writing these poems on the wall to document their experience. So once that was discovered, a fundraising effort began to save Angel Island. And so you're starting to see like a very similar thing with both Angel Island and what happened in New York Harbor. We've got poetry and we've got a fundraising effort at two different times in history, literally like a century apart. But yeah, it's in the 1970s that this fundraising effort happens to save Angel Island out in San Francisco Bay, to keep this building up, and then to begin the process of delicately restoring the wood. A lot of it had decayed, because it's, 60 years old at least. And then to try to read all of these poems, and then to get these poems published as a very important part of the American immigration experience. And so you can today go to Angel Island in the San Francisco Bay area. It is a state park there. And many people today applaud Alexander Weiss for being the savior of Angel Island. And it's interesting to compare and contrast the poems of Angel Island with Emma Lazarus's The New Colossus. So The New Colossus on the Statue of Liberty is such a welcoming poem. But here on Angel Island, you have the poetry of people who are struggling to become an American citizen. Now, because these poems were originally written in Chinese, they don't have the same kind of beat and rhyme as a poem written in English would have. So this reads a little bit more like prose, but it still gives us a good insight into what people actually experienced on Angel Island. So let's read one of the poems. This one says, "Originally, I had intended to come to America last year. Lack of money delayed me until early autumn. It was on that day that the weaver maiden met the cowherd that I took passage on the President Lincoln. I ate wind and tasted waves for more than 20 days. Fortunately, I arrived safely on the American continent. I thought I could land in a few days. How was I to know that I would become a prisoner, suffering in the wooden building? The barbarian's abuse is really difficult to take. When my family circumstances stir my emotions, a double stream of tears flows. I only wish I can land in San Francisco soon, thus sparing me this additional sorrow here." The United States of America, since its very beginnings as English colonies, has always been a land of immigrants, with the exception of the Native Americans, whose presence here dates back to 13,000 years. The United States of America is ideally a melting pot. We are, in theory, all but a bunch of mutts. There is no single immigration experience. Every immigrant that came to the United States of America came from a different background. Each had their own hopes. Each had their own ideas of what the United States would be to them. Each of them had a different experience, a unique experience, once they finally arrived on our shores. So it's very difficult for the history teacher or the historian to try to summarize all of the immigrant experiences into one thing. But we can say this: we are a country filled of immigrants. My ancestors with the last name Endress, they arrived here in the United States of America in the late 1880s. When did your family arrive? What do you think they went through? There are millions of stories, and what the United States is today is in part the sum total of all of those stories. For most immigrants, the United States of America was a land of hope where things could be better than wherever it is they came from. And for many immigrants still today, that general idea of the United States of America remains the same. So after the Civil War from 1865, going into the 1920s, there was a great immigration boom in the United States of America that was creating this new ethnic makeup of the United States of America. And America, with its Statue of Liberty, was seen around the world as this great place to go to start a new life. But there was another demographic shift that was happening at this exact same time. People were leaving the farms of the countryside and they were moving into the cities. That's because agriculture, new forms of technology had improved agriculture so much that you simply didn't need to have as many people working on the farms when you get to the late 19th century. At the beginning of the 19th century, in the year 1800, 80% of Americans were farmers. When you get to the year 1900, 100 years later, that number has gone down to less than 40%. So fewer and fewer Americans are living on farms and they are moving to the cities. So a nice simple way to remember this demographic shift is in the late 19th century, Americans are moving away from the farms and into the factories. From the farm to the factory. Why the factory? Well, that's where the jobs are. The same new technological innovations that are making farming more efficient, so we need fewer people on the farms, are creating mass production factories in the cities. So we have in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the boom of big cities. Now, New York City has always been a big city, but it's going to continue to grow. But now, out of nowhere, we're going to have cities like Pittsburgh, Chicago. These are going to become some of the fastest growing cities in the entire world at this point in time in history. And so now in the lecture is when we look at some of the individuals who are working in these factories in the cities. So for me, one of the best ways for me to describe what these men's lives were like working in the factories and in other urban industries at this point in time in history, it's probably best for me to go back to revisit this fundamental idea of capitalism. So Adam Smith said that self-interest and your desire to make money is a good thing. And Adam Smith explains this in The Wealth of Nations. He says, when you want to make money, then you are going to provide a good or a service for the community that the community will appreciate. So for example, if you want to make money right now and it's the fall, well, then you can grab a rake and go rake yards and people will pay you for this. And so you get money. That's good. You like making money. And your neighbors have their yard raked and they didn't have to do it. They got to, watch a football game or something instead. And so it's a win-win, right? Ideally, according to Adam Smith, yes. But now let's look at how this plays out within the context of the late 19th century and the era of newly emerging big businesses and mass production. Okay, so let's take the case of Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie, brilliant innovator, incredible entrepreneur, starts the Carnegie Steel Company. Now, when Andrew Carnegie wants to start mass producing steel in the 1870s, he doesn't have the capital back then to just, build a steel mill. Like, he's going to need investors, people who are going to believe in his dream of mass producing steel and give him the money to start it up. So there are the hundreds of people that invest in Carnegie Steel. And if you are an investor, if you would invest in any company, well, you expect a return on your investment. So for example, today, if I decide I would like to invest in Amazon, I'll invest, let's say, $100 in Amazon with the hopes that maybe 5 years from now, my $100 will turn into $1,000 because Amazon has grown as a company and I sell my stocks and I cash in and I get my grand. And I'm like, woohoo, I made money without really even doing anything. I just invested it. So Andrew Carnegie is under pressure from investors to make money for them. The investors are also represented by a board of directors that helps to run the company. So it helps to know that Andrew Carnegie isn't just an independent agent running his own steel company, Carnegie Steel. He's under pressure. His pressure is to make money so that Carnegie Steel does well and investors can get a return on their investment. Okay, so to repeat, Andrew Carnegie is under pressure to make money. So how does he get this money? Well, he's making steel, but of course it's not him who's making steel. He pays hundreds of other people to, build his steel works and make the steel. And so here are the guys that, some of the guys that make the steel for Andrew Carnegie. So the steel is made and then the steel is sold. And then part of the profits of making that steel or of the steel go to pay the men who have actually been making the steel in the steel mills. And then whatever is left over, well, that then belongs to Andrew Carnegie and the investors. So now put yourself in the shoes of Andrew Carnegie. Right here, put yourself in the shoes of Andrew Carnegie. Okay, your job is to make as much money for the investors as possible. You do this by having these steel mills built. You hire the men to make the steel. The steel is then shipped out and sold. You collect a whole bunch of money. Part of that money, a huge part of that money, goes to pay the men. The rest of it belongs to you and the investors. Now, you need to keep those investors happy so that they continue to invest money into Carnegie Steel, so that more people invest money into Carnegie Steel, so that you can make more steel, so that you can become even wealthier. Now, hopefully you understand the setup. How do you make money, more money for the investors? What can you do, in other words, to trim costs so that the investors get more of a bang for their buck? Let's say you've done everything possible in your steel mill to trim the cost of making steel. Where else then can you cut costs? That's the pressure that Carnegie's under. What would you do, or what could you do if you're Andrew Carnegie? Well, Hopefully your mind is going in this direction. One of the things you could do is begin to cut the salaries of the men. You could nickel and dime them a little bit. If they're getting paid, and I would just make up some numbers here, if they're getting paid $1 a day, well, cut it down to like 95 cents a day. Now you could do that. You could also try to pay them as little as possible, maybe even less than a living wage. You could have them live in poverty in horrible situations like the image that you see here. If you do that to these guys and they still continue to make steel for you, then Carnegie Steel is going to do really well. The investors are going to be really happy, and more people are going to invest in your company, knowing that they too are going to get a great return on their investment. So you, Andrew Carnegie, are under pressure to pay your men as little as possible. And if they don't like it, well then, hey, they can go get a job elsewhere. So now, right here, let me pause. First of all, it's worth knowing Andrew Carnegie, well, historians argue and debate about what I'm going to say here, but he cared for his workers. It seems like Andrew Carnegie cared for his workers. Remember that Andrew Carnegie himself was born a poor boy in Scotland, came to Pittsburgh, got an apprenticeship working for a railroad company, worked his way up, eventually got into the steel business, had to borrow a lot of money to start up his steel business, but it was a huge gamble. But then ultimately he ends up being one of the most successful entrepreneurs of all time. But he was a rags to riches story. And so it seems like he cared for the poor because he was poor when he was a kid. He was very poor. And we see with Andrew Carnegie, and as we will see later on here, he had a difficult time personally cutting the wages of his men, even when he was under pressure to do so. Now, historians will argue and debate about what I just said, and to what degree did he care about his men. But we'll see how this plays out in a famous event called the Homestead Strike here in a few minutes. But so Andrew Carnegie is still under pressure to pay these men as little as possible. So what we're seeing here is this whole profit incentive playing out in terms of how it actually affects people's lives, especially during the industrial era of the late 19th century. The management of Carnegie Steel could just go, listen guys, we're going to pay you as little as possible. If you don't like it, leave. And then if too many people leave, then Carnegie Steel will go, oops, we paid the men too little, and then we'll increase the wages and more of them will actually come back and work for us. So it should work itself out in terms of supply and demand. And here's where we once again reintroduce this term, this concept of social Darwinism. And this was Carnegie's attitude. Social Darwinism is the idea that life is a competition. Everything in life is a competition. It is what he called a survival of the fittest. Remember that it was the English philosopher Herbert Spencer who coined the term social Darwinism and the phrase survival of the fittest, but it was embraced by Andrew Carnegie. He wrote about it in his book. Do you remember the name of his book? The Gospel of Wealth. He believed in this. So if he believed in this, then here's what he believed. It's tough being a factory worker, but if you don't like it, then get out. But if you get out, you're going to have to find another way to make money. And you could work hard too. You could come up with an innovative thing. Andrew Carnegie started off with nothing and ended up owning multiple steel mills. Well, what's to say you can't too? So if you don't like your life, then change it. But you're going to have to change it using your own intelligence, your own tenacity, your own grit. And if you got what it takes, then you too can become a multimillionaire. But if you don't have what it takes, or if you're not even willing to try, then hey, quit your complaining about being a factory worker. So this is essentially social Darwinism, what it is and what it is. And hopefully you can see how the wealthy would embrace this philosophy of social Darwinism versus if you are an actual factory worker and you're like, I got a family, I've got a wife, I've got 3 kids, I'm trying to make ends meet. I don't know what other jobs are out there. I don't know what it would take to actually go and try to find the jobs, try to start a new business or something like that. I'm stuck. How this idea of social Darwinism really would not be widely embraced by some of the poor working class. And I guess it might be meaningful for you personally to develop your own opinion about social Darwinism. Do you agree that this is what life is like, that it's a competition? Everybody's on their own. Those that have the grit, the tenacity, and the intelligence, they're the ones who will strike it out on their own. And that if you don't survive in this competitive world, then it's nobody's fault but your own. So, it just might be meaningful for you just to take a moment and to think about that and to think what you think, to develop your own perspective on this theory of social Darwinism. Okay. So social Darwinism wasn't the only idea, the only big idea that was around in the late 19th century in response to this new growing situation of people living in factories, working in factories, living in cities, living in tenements. There were other new ideas and economic theories and political movements that began arising out of this new industrial era. And it is very important that we learn about these things too. All right. Okay, so the first movement that I would like for you to know about that comes out of the industrial era is the creation of labor unions. Before you can understand what a labor union is, you really need to understand the historical context of the labor unions. So we start industrializing in the late 19th century after the Civil War mostly. We've never had big cities and big factories with hundreds of people working in them before this time of period of history. Most people have lived on farms and worked on farms, but as we learn, people move from the farms into the cities to work in the factories. And so as this develops, there are no regulations for the factories because this is a new thing in history. So things like minimum wage or having a minimum pay for workers, having any type of regulation for working conditions, just safety regulations, to simple things like bathroom breaks and lunch breaks. And there's also no regulation for anything like for what we call workers' compensation. So if you got hurt on the job, there are no laws that say that business, your employer, that they have to pay you anything or pay for your doctor's bills or anything like that. So as these huge factories are created, as this new working condition is created, it's so new, there are no government regulations. There are no laws to protect the workers. You are there working by your own free will. You can leave at any time, but while you're there, you personally accept all the risks and the conditions of being there. So if your employer says you're going to do highly dangerous work around this bandsaw, you're going to work for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, there's poor ventilation, you're going to get a half-hour food break, limited bathroom breaks, and we're going to pay you 15 cents a day. And that's the job. You can take it or you can move on. And those would be real conditions that people in the late 19th century would have to deal with. So let's say you decide to accept those conditions. You're probably only going to accept those conditions because there are no other opportunities. So life's going to be rough, but you don't really have any other opportunities, and at least it's a job and you can provide for your family a little bit. Okay, so if you're in that position, if you are one of these working men in the factories, is there anything you can do to improve that situation? Okay, once you start there, you can start to understand the significance of labor unions and why labor unions come around. These men who worked in factories, textile factories that produced clothes, steel factories that produced steel, oil refineries that made kerosene and gasoline, railroad workers that worked on the railroads. These individuals who lived and worked in some pretty rough conditions believed that the one and only way that they could improve their working conditions was to organize, to create a collective group, a labor union. And a union would be represented by one or a handful of individuals that would negotiate with the management of the company. Okay. So, for example, let's say you're in a timber mill. I mentioned wood cutting earlier. Let me just stick with it. So let's say you're in a timber mill and you're working in these dangerous conditions, these long hours for little pay, and it's a dangerous job. And if you got hurt on the job, the company's not going to help you out. you lose your job, you can't pay your doctor's bills, you can't take care of your family. Like, it's going to be a horrible catastrophe if something bad happens to you. So this is a terrible situation, and yet you're making a bunch of money for this company because you're the one who's cutting the wood. You're turning trees into 2x4s or whatever. So what can you do? Okay, so here's what you do. To create a labor union, you get everybody together, you get all the workers together, and you say, okay, what do we want? And you say, how about instead of a 12-hour day, we have a 10-hour day, but we get paid the same. So instead of getting paid $1 a day for working 12 hours, we get paid $1 a day for working 10. That way we have a little bit more time with our family. Okay, we all agree with this? Agreed. We take a vote. Majority says yes, we want to work 10 hours instead of 12. Okay, agreed. We also would like to have some sort of workers' compensation. We do a very dangerous job. If we get hurt on the job, we want the company to pay a certain amount of our doctor's bills. Let's say the company pays 80% of our doctor's bills or something like that. So, okay, do we all agree with this? Take a vote. Majority says yes. Yes, we agree. Okay, so this is what we want to do. So collectively, the workers say, these are the things that we want. They pick a few, one or a handful of individuals to represent their union to go and negotiate with the management of the company. Now, obviously, you're going to want these union representatives to be individuals who are fighters. They're going to have this, tough guy personality to sort of, when they negotiate, they don't negotiate weekly saying, hey, can we please have a 10-hour work day? No, you want to have somebody in there who really represents you, who has your best interest at heart. So these labor union leaders that we're going to learn about, they're tough guys. They're very persuasive. They're going to fight for the interest of their men, and the men want somebody who's tough and persuasive to represent them. So the union leaders sit down to negotiate if they can with the management. They have talks, they have a negotiation, and then possibly they come up with a contract, an agreement that both sides agree to. Now, management's under pressure not to agree to working with this labor union because they're like, wait a minute, if we got to pay for the health care of an injured worker, well, that's a lot of money. And less money means less of a profit for us, and our investors don't get as good of a return. So we don't want to pay for the doctor's bill of an employee that got hurt. So then ideally a negotiation would happen. So it's like management says, we want you to work 12 days. The workers say, we want you to work 12 hours. The workers say, well, we only want to work 10 hours a day. Okay, we compromise on 11. The workers say we want for management to pay 80% of our doctor's bill if we get hurt on a job. Management says, well, we ideally like to pay 0. Well, we'll compromise at 50%. And then they agree to it, and they come up with a contract. Everybody signs it, and all is well. This type of negotiation is called collective bargaining. And what I just described in terms of a process is sort of idealistic. It didn't really work like that in the late 19th century. It was much more antagonistic. But ideally, that's how it's supposed to work. So a labor union. Let's go back to that. What is a labor union? A labor union is a workers' organization that negotiates with management for better pay or working conditions. It's as simple as that. But my idealistic situation that I just described was just that. It was idealistic. Here's what went down, and we'll learn about specific examples of this here in a few minutes. Is management really going to even want to talk to these labor union representatives? First of all, be on the side of management here for a second. Like, your job is to make as much money as possible. You're offering these guys jobs. They can there's nothing to stop them from leaving. If they can find a better job elsewhere, go get a better job. But otherwise, this is the best that you've got. So take it. So the first thing you're going to do is try to do your best to make labor unions illegal. So if you find out that men are meeting to form a labor union, then that is grounds for firing them immediately. Stop the formation of labor unions. And management companies will do that in the late 19th century. They'll just make labor unions illegal. You cannot work here if you're part of a union. But then, even if they do form a union and they want to meet with you and talk, you're just going to say, I'm not going to talk. Here's the job. Here's the pay. Take it or leave it. So that's more likely what management's going to do. Okay, so now on the other side, labor, the workers. What are you going to do if management just stonewalls you like this and they refuse to talk at all and are firing people who are trying to form unions? Are you just going to tuck your tail in between your legs and submit? Or are you going to try to fight? And if so, how do you fight? Okay, so let's talk about how labor unions would fight against an uncooperative, non-negotiating management. So labor unions pretty much have only one tool in their toolkit to try to fight management, and that is something called a strike. So a strike is a very important term to know and to understand in the history of the United States, especially when it comes to workers and management and labor relations and the whole labor history of the United States of America. So here's what a strike is. It's pretty easy to imagine, and some of you might already be familiar with what a strike is. A strike is essentially defined as a refusal to work. And it works like this. Workers are working in poor conditions for poor wages. So they try to first negotiate with the management, but if the management says, no, we're not talking to you, then a labor union will organize a strike. All the workers get together and say, we refuse to work. So we are essentially going to shut down production entirely. Okay. By shutting down production, nothing gets made, therefore nothing gets sold, therefore the business starts to do poorly. If the business isn't making any money, the goal is to get management to go to the workers, to go to the representatives of the labor unions and say, okay, let's talk, let's negotiate now. But chances are management is not going to do that right away. If all the workers refuse to work, then likely the first thing management will do is quite simply say, all right, you guys refuse to work, therefore you're now all fired, and we're simply going to hire other people to do your jobs. So there is a slang term, which is a derogatory term that you should know, which identifies a person who is hired to take the job of somebody who is on strike. And that that person is called a scab. So if all the workers go on strike, management's like, all right, you guys are all fired, and we're going to hire these people to come and take your spot, and they'll work in these conditions for this pay. They're willing to do it, even though you're not. And the individuals on strike call their replacements scabs. Okay, so a labor union, obviously, if they're going on strike, they have to stop the situation where a scab is going to take their job. And so you might think, well, how would they do this? Well, one of the ways that they do this is they try to physically stop anybody from going into the factory. So they'll barricade the factory. Sometimes there will be lock-ins. They'll lock themselves in to stop somebody from coming in and taking their job. But while they're in, they refuse to work. Now, if you're imagining this type of situation, hopefully you can see how this is going to lead, or may potentially lead in some cases, to a violent confrontation. If you've got workers who are on strike, but they're holding themselves in the factory, well, that factory they don't own that factory. The factory owners own that factory. And so the owners can hire policemen and sometimes even other hired hands to come in and forcefully remove the strikers. And this can lead to a bloody confrontation. And it does several times. Strikes in the late 19th century, many of them end in violence. But ideally, if a labor union is successful in organizing a strike and shutting down the factory and keeping the factory shut down, then that would force management to negotiate with them to come up with a new and better contract for the workers. So there's sort of the idea of what a labor union is, what it's to do, how it's to improve the conditions of the workers. Hopefully you understand the idea of a strike. You can define the word scab. And we'll learn here later on about actual strikes and what goes down during those strikes. It's fairly dramatic in the late 19th century. Okay, but in terms of a response to the new economic and cultural conditions of the industrial era of the late 19th century, the labor union movement was actually one of the more moderate movements that was happening in the late 19th century. There were other more radical movements to change the situation, to redistribute the wealth of the country so that there would be fewer poor people. So one idea is the idea of socialism. Socialism is actually a very difficult word to define And it's difficult to define because it's been used in different ways, and there's sort of a variety of different types of socialist theories. But it is also extraordinarily hard for me as a history teacher today to define it because it's such a loaded term today. Almost invariably, if I hear the word socialist today, it's being used as an insult. There is a great deal of stigma around this word today. So let me just sort of do my best to keep with the basics here of socialism. Socialism is a term that developed throughout the 19th century. There were a wide variety of economic theorists that identified as a socialist. They identified as socialist, but their ideas were all different in slightly different ways. But the one thing they all had in common was this. The socialists of the 19th century all believed that businesses, companies, factories, any organization that provided a good or a service for the people should be controlled either a little bit or a lot. It should be controlled on some level by the government. And when I say by the government, I mean by democratically elected representatives in the government, so that the community controls these companies either in part or in whole by elected representatives. Okay, so that's a very loose description, and I'm sorry. I don't have a very specific description for you here. I do have this more specific definition on your screen. Socialism can be defined as a political and economic theory that advocates for some level of community control over companies. So now, even though this is a loose definition, the fundamental idea here is that when a community controls a business or a company, then they can regulate that company. And therefore, the management of the company doesn't just fall to the board of directors and to the investors and to people that want to make money, so that the community can play some role in the conditions in which the individuals are working, the hours that they work, the pay, etc. Okay, so let me try to give you a more specific example of socialism in the 19th century. So this example, again, it's just one of many examples of socialism, but hopefully this one specific example will give you a sense of how this was an idea that was supposed to help improve the conditions for the workers in the factories. So here we go. In the early 19th century, there was a man from Scotland named Robert Owen. And Robert Owen actually came to live in the United States of America, specifically in a city called New Harmony, Indiana, for a while, where he tried to implement some of his socialist ideals. So here's what Robert Owen did. Robert Owen was a factory owner in Scotland. He owned a factory. So he was the big boss man. But he also really believed in improving the conditions of his workers. So what he did was this. He gave the control of the factory over to the workers. He let the workers govern the factory. So the workers themselves got together and negotiated, or determined really, collectively, here are the hours that we're going to work. Here's how much we're going to get paid. Here's how much you, Robert Owen, are going to get paid. Here's how much the managers are going to get paid. The guys on the floor, here's how much they're going to get paid. Here are the working hours. Here are the conditions. And they set it up. So in other words, Robert Owen made the workers shareholders in the company. Because the workers still want to get paid. They still want to work in this factory, which means they're still going to be interested in producing a lot of, I think it was textiles, clothing, so that more get sold, so they get paid as much as possible, but the wealth is going to be distributed a lot more evenly. So instead of having the workers be in a situation where they are in conflict with the management, he simply made the workers the management. The workers are going to govern the factory. So that's what Robert Owen did. So how did this work out? Well, in Scotland, it worked out well. His factory was successful, and then he sold it and he moved to Indiana, where his factory or his production facility in Indiana, it was not a success. And so for Robert Owen's socialist plan, he had one win and one loss. So you can determine for yourself if socialism works, or at least if that particular brand of socialism works. Okay, but this is another response, along with labor unions, to the new economic and cultural situation of the industrial era and the growing number of individuals working these very strenuous jobs in factories and elsewhere. All right, there's one last term that we need to learn for this era in terms of a radical response to the new harsh situation that workers are in. And that's this, and this is the most radical of it all, of them all. This is anarchism. Anarchy is a Greek word that means without government. Anarchism was a theory that we'd actually be better off and human beings would be kinder, better people if there was simply no government at all. When the anarchist movement emerged in the late 19th century as this radical movement, it was supported mostly by truly desperate people. And the historical context helps us to understand the desperation of these people. Remember that big businesses and factories are a very, very new thing in the 19th century, and people are leaving the countryside and the life of farms. And life wasn't necessarily easy on the farm, but you're in nature, you're in villages, you're not living in densely populated cities. So when this big demographic shift happens and people start living in these tight tenements, and they're working, some of them literally 7 days a week and long hours. I mean, we're talking 10 to 12, sometimes more hours a day, no break for little pay. And there's no sense of hope that things are going to get better. And then when you find that governments, when they do step in to intervene with problems between labor and management, almost invariably the government steps in to help the management. They tend to help the owners of the factories. And when that's the situation, people turned desperate. A lot of people turned to drugs and alcohol, just like they might today. And other people turned really angry. They wanted to fight. So the anarchist movement was this movement to remove all sources of power, to simply destroy the system. And so, probably without surprise, the most famous anarchists were terrorists, because these were the individuals that made the news. Anarchists would many times go after business owners, the factory owners, and they would just simply try to kill them. They would also go after politicians, political leaders who were supporting big business and who most likely were in the pocket of big business. So the anarchist movement, which many times, in many cases, was a terrorist movement, this movement was overall only a small group of people, like the labor unions. Many, many people were in the labor unions, but very few people overall became anarchists. But this minority, because they were violent, they will strike several times in American history, and we'll learn about this, and they change American history. There will even be one president who will be assassinated by an anarchist. Now, there are other peaceful anarchists who tend to just be writers. They tend to write about how society would be better if there was no traditional structure of power and people were just all equal and free. And we'll learn about them as well. So, in summary, the anarchist movement, small but extraordinarily radical, wants to completely create a new society where everybody's equal. The socialist movement, which wants to, in some way, shape, or form, place businesses and companies and factories under community control to some degree. And then the biggest movement of them all, which was the least radical, but they still wanted significant social change, was the labor union movement. So let's go back to the labor unions and start here. All right, so there were many labor unions throughout the United States of America. There were unions for steel workers. There were unions for railroad workers. There were unions for even cigar makers. And in fact, one of the most important labor unions that we're going to talk about was established by this man who started off in a cigar makers union. His name was Samuel Gompers. Samuel Gompers was a labor union organizer. He's a very interesting man in United States history because, well, there are people who don't like him from both sides. There are liberal people who don't like him because they didn't think he was radical enough. And there are conservatives who think, well, he just was too radical. He's an interesting man. If you could go back and meet Samuel Gompers, what would he say about himself? Samuel Gompers became a labor union organizer as a way to both provide a better life for workers and to stop the development of radical groups. For Samuel Gompers, it's very easy. He's like these workers, like individuals who work in steel mills and work on railroad lines. Their lives are so rough, they're so difficult, they need improvement. So they can improve their lives through labor unions. That's a way to improve their lives. Now, if they don't have the opportunity to join a labor union, then what's going to happen? They're going to turn into anarchists and radical socialists. And Gompers wanted to stop those radical movements from happening. Samuel Gompers himself was born in England and immigrated to the United States of America. Like I said before, he worked in a cigar rolling factory. That's where he got his start as a young boy, actually. He was Jewish as well, and he's many times identified as one of the greatest Jewish American figures in American history. And Gompers himself, when he moved to the United States of America, he was only 13 years old, and he lived in the famous Lower East Side of Manhattan in a large Jewish community. And that Jewish community in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, it was a very intellectual community. There were a lot of ideas that were being discussed. And I think Samuel Gompers was very inspired by a lot of the ideas that he was hearing as a teenager. And he also wanted to be one of these movers and shakers who wanted to put ideas into action. He wanted to, not just discuss ideas, but really work to make America a better place. And he was fairly young, only 31 years old, when he formed his first labor union to advocate for the rights of workers. And then 5 years later, he established a nationwide labor union. It was called the American Federation of Labor, which was simply abbreviated to the AFL. And coincidentally, the AFL was established in downtown Columbus, Ohio. There's actually a historical marker on East Long Street in Columbus where the AFL had their first meeting and they elected Samuel Gompers as their president. So Gompers, when he established the AFL, he was really concerned about its public image. And this, in and of itself, was a rather controversial thing. He wanted for politicians, the American public in general, as well as business owners and everybody, to look upon the workers of and the laborers of the United States of America as skilled, strong, tough, white men. Okay, so who was allowed to join the AFL? Women were not allowed to join the AFL. Black people were not allowed to join the AFL. Unskilled laborers were not allowed to join the AFL. So the AFL was an exclusive club of skilled laborers who were white men. And Gompers did this because he thought that if you had unskilled laborers in there, if you had women in there, if you had black men in there, then he would not be able to negotiate as strongly or as effectively. So let me really briefly here differentiate between skilled labor and unskilled labor. Skilled labor would be a job where there is training that is necessary, extensive training to develop a particular skill, versus unskilled labor, which is a job that nearly anybody could do. So for example, today, to be an electrician, you would be skilled labor if you're an electrician, because it takes a long time to learn about electricity and how to repair and install electrical devices. So, if I need an electrician in my home to come and, let's say, instill new light bulbs in my ceiling or something like this, that individual who came in to do that job would be very highly trained, or at least they'd hopefully be very highly trained, and it would be a skill that they would develop over years. They'd get better at it as they went along. Versus unskilled labor. Unskilled labor would be, let's say, a fry cook at McDonald's. Yes, it does take a little bit of time to learn how to make a hamburger and cook fries at McDonald's and to, deal with customers and all that. It's not like you can just walk in and do that. But it also doesn't take too much time to figure out how to do that. And if somebody, gets fired from their job there, it's not too hard to replace them with somebody else. So Gompers in the AFL, they would only accept skilled labor into the AFL. So the AFL only fought for and supported for the working conditions for these skilled laborers, who would of course be white men. For Samuel Gompers, these are the people that we have to fight for. We can't let everybody in, but these are the ones that we're going to fight for. And these individuals, these men, in the 1880s, they work in unregulated working conditions. Some of them work very difficult jobs for very, very long hours in dangerous conditions. This is wrong. There are no laws to protect these individuals. A manager could just fire one of them on the spot, and there's nothing that the guy could do. If a man got hurt on the job, there's no workers' comp. And how is he supposed to pay to take care of his family or himself or his doctor's bill if he's seriously injured? Samuel Gompers is going to organize these men. He's going to negotiate on their behalf, and when necessary, he'll help them strike. Now, specifically, Samuel Gompers and the AFL fought for the 8-hour workday. He simply believed that 8 hours was the total amount of work that you should do. It was sort of the healthy limit. And he had this little catchphrase. He said that there should be 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what you will. So Samuel Gompers, very interesting guy, fighting for the labor class, but also would remind the conservatives who did not believe in organized labor, and these would be the rich guys, he would tell them, don't you see what I'm doing here? I'm stopping them from becoming radicals. If you don't want socialism and you don't want anarchism, you better support the labor unions. All right, so let's get to the actual conflicts between labor and management. There are 3 major events in the late 19th century that I would like for you to know about. And we're going to go through each of these 3 events one by one. The first is the Haymarket Square Affair. Let me say that more clearly. The first is the Haymarket Square Affair of 1886. The second is the Homestead Strike of 1892. And the third is the Pullman Strike of 1894. I'm going to go over each of these in chronological order. Let's first take it to Chicago, Illinois in 1886, where we had the Haymarket Square Affair. In the 1880s, Chicago, Illinois, resting upon the Chicago River as it flows into Lake Michigan. The Windy City, there it is. It was the fastest growing city in the entire world in the 1880s. It was a boom town. It was receiving immigrants from all over the world, but especially at this point in time in history, Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe. There are so many immigrants that are coming into the city that there are more individuals than there are jobs, which made life great for the business owners and horrible for the working class. Because, if you're the owner of a factory, you can say, all right, I'm going to pay you as little as I want. And because there are so many people out there that are desperate for a job, if you don't like it, you can leave and I'll bring somebody else in, no problem. And so on the streets of Chicago, Illinois in the late 19th century, you had scenes of desperation like this. This is a terrible image with a dead horse on a street, children living in poverty. In a future lecture, we'll learn about a woman by the name of Jane Addams who really worked hard to get these poor kids off the streets of Chicago and give them an education and a better life. But when you have so many thousands of people living in poverty, and really extreme poverty in Chicago in the late 19th century, and a handful of super rich people who really didn't seem to care too much that their workers were living in poverty, it's not hard to imagine how some of the even more extreme, the most radical ideas like anarchism start spreading among the people. Yeah, let's just get some guns and kill the rich people. And there were anarchist movements in Chicago, again, still only a small minority of people, but they were there. And they even had newspapers. There were 2 prominent anarchist newspapers in Chicago in the 1880s. So that's the scene in Chicago in the 1880s, and that helps us to better understand what goes down at Haymarket Square. So in the greater Chicago area, there was the McCormick Reaper Works. They made farming equipment. And the workers that ran the machines that made the farming equipment were working 12-hour days. And in 1886, they decided to go on strike to reduce their working day from 12 hours to 8. When the workers went on strike to protest for this shorter working day, they were locked out of the factory. They, of course, surrounded the factory trying to stop scabs from going in, But to protect the private property of the factory owners had called in the Chicago police. And this was a very tense situation. The police were there doing their job, protecting the private property of the factory. They were surrounded by thousands, literally in the tens of thousands, of men striking and their supporters who were attempting to try to stop traffic and anything from going in or out of the McCormick Reaper Works. So things get tense, and eventually the police fired upon the crowd. They killed 2 men. So let's pause the story here to talk briefly about the situation of the Chicago police. The policemen had a thankless and very dangerous job. The police tended to come from the exact same social group, the exact same economic and social group as the workers. Policemen aren't wealthy individuals. They are working class men too. But in the cases of the strikes, they are the ones that are called upon to restore law and order, and this typically means protecting the private property of the wealthy industrialist. They have to protect the factories from the strikers, and this puts them on the front lines of confrontation with the strikers. The police tend to be outnumbered. Certainly they were outnumbered significantly at the McCormick Reaper Works in 1886, and that can make them very much on edge, and very likely, in order to defend themselves, to fire into a crowd. So life is not easy as a police officer, and there's a pretty good chance that you are living in the same working class neighborhoods as the workers who are going on strike. And certainly as a police officer, you're in the minority, whereas the factory laborers would be in the majority. This was a tough situation to be in, and a lot of police officers developed, understandably, a very negative attitude towards individuals going on strike. This wasn't universal, but it was sort of the general attitude of the police officers, even though the police officers themselves have their own labor union, and there will be times in American history where police officers will go on strike. Famously, that happened in the early 20th century in Boston, because even police officers want decent pay and decent working hours. But okay, let's take it back to Chicago in 1886. Needless to say, after the strike and the shootings at the McCormick Reaper Works, there was a lot of anger and antagonism between the working class laborers in the factory and the Chicago police. So after the shootings, there was a rally that was held, simply to protest the shootings of the strikers. This rally was advertised in some journals, including the 2 prominent anarchist newspapers in Chicago. If you take a look at this one, this is rather interesting. You have an advertisement for this mass meeting. It says tonight at 7:30 o'clock at the Haymarket Square. And please note that it says, working men, arm yourself and appear in full force. So in other words, bring your gun. Notice that it's written in English on the top, and then the bottom half, it's written in German. Why was it written in German in Chicago? Well, because there were a large number of German immigrants who lived in Chicago. And the man who actually published this newspaper was himself a German immigrant and an anarchist. Haymarket Square was a lively and vibrant marketplace. It was the end of a trolley line in Chicago at that point in time. And it was truly a market, a place where farmers and merchants would come to sell their goods. It tended to be very busy during the daytime. And in the evening, the markets had cleared out. And on the evening of May the 4th, 1886, this rally was held to honor the 2 people who had died and to continue to protest for the 8-hour working day. Now, all this rally was people giving speeches. That's it. The people who had organized the Haymarket rally were hoping for 20,000 people to show up, but they were sorely disappointed when only 3,000 people showed up. And as evening drew in and the speeches began, the weather was nice. It's May, it's Chicago. But strangely, the weather began to change once the speeches began. It was Chicago. The Chicago winds started blowing. It started getting overcast, then it started drizzling. Of the 3,000 that showed up, a lot of them started leaving, so that we were left with, and we don't know exactly how many, but a few hundred. Now remember that the flyers that were advertising this particular event had encouraged the working men to show up bearing arms, to bring their guns. This had alerted the police. So the police show up to the rally at almost the exact same time that many people were leaving. We do know how many police were there, 176. So you had nearly the same number of police officers as you have people there listening to the speakers. But now it's getting dark, the rain is coming in, there is only one street lamp to light up this situation. And when the police walk into it, they simply start asking people to disperse, leave, go home. Now understand that the police are not really welcomed by this group of people. After all, the police had shot 2 people at the McCormick Reaper Works. And so when the police show up, start pushing people aside, telling them to go home to try to break up this rally, somebody threw a bomb. We don't know who, but it was thrown from the protesters, from the people at the rally, into the police. This little handheld explosive device with a wick was lit. People heard it hissing through the air. It landed among the police. The bomb lands among the police officers and explodes, injuring several police officers and knocking out the one street lamp. So now it's dark, it's raining, a bomb just went off. People are screaming, both because they are hurt, other people are screaming because they are fearful of what's going on. The police know a bomb has just been thrown at them, so what do? They unholster their guns and they fire into the crowd. It was bedlam. It was panic. It was chaos. And people ran. 7 police officers were seriously injured. They were taken to a hospital where they were in a great deal of pain for several days. And then they died. One of the civilians who was shot by the police died. And just who threw this bomb? And I guess I should forward to this picture. Here's an artist's rendition of what happened at Haymarket Square. Well, just who threw this bomb? We don't know. We don't know. But there was a real effort to find out who did throw the bomb. Now, if you were the district attorney, or if you were the chief of police, how would you try to figure out who threw the bomb? How do you even know who was there? It was dark out. It's not like they took attendance at these meetings. There's no list of individuals who were there. Certainly nobody's going to tell you they were there. But you do know the journals that advertised it, and you know those journals are published by anarchist extremists. So in the aftermath of the Haymarket disaster, 8 men were arrested. 2 of these 8 men were speakers. 6 of these men weren't even there or present. So in no way could they have thrown the bomb. And 2 of the men who weren't there were journalists, professed anarchists who had advertised the event. Now, of these 8 men, 7 of them, and that's why you see an image of 7 men here, they will be condemned to death. 2 will plead for mercy and have their sentences reduced to life in prison. One of those individuals, the youngest to be sentenced, he was 21 years old. And while he was in prison, he got a dynamite cap and ignited it in his mouth, blowing his head off. Now, there was no proof that any of these individuals threw the bomb. And still to this day, we don't know who threw the bomb. So why did these men get arrested? Why were they placed on trial? Why were 7 of them condemned to death? Well, because they expressed sympathy, and some of them openly advertised in favor of anarchism. They were placed on trial because of their beliefs. So now let me briefly talk about the 2 journalists, the 2 men who were journalists at this trial. One of these anarchist journalists was named Albert Parsons. He was not present at the Haymarket Square riot, but still he was condemned to death at the trial. I have a picture of both Albert and his wife, Lucy Parsons, just because, man, what an interesting relationship this was. Albert Parsons is from the South originally. He was a soldier in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. After the war, he married Lucy, who was a freed slave, a former slave from the South. Now, it would have been a rare thing to have a mixed race marriage in the United States at this point in time in history, a very rare thing. And one of these marriages to be between a former Confederate soldier and a slave, I think this was an exceptional relationship, especially in the 19th century. After Albert was condemned to death, Lucy Parsons would go on to become an anarchist writer throughout the rest of her life. She continued to be an agitator for workers' rights. That there is a portrait of her from the early 20th century. So before I discuss the other journalist who had advertised the Haymarket Square meeting, let me show you an image of the courtroom. It's kind of an interesting setup with both prosecutors and defendants sitting at these square tables and people looking upon them on all sides. I don't exactly know who are supposed to be the spectators here and who the jury is, but take a look at the judge's bench. Yeah, take a look at the judge's bench. So for me, this is kind of a very strange and I think for me personally, just a disgusting part of the story. You'll see that it's not just the judge that's sitting up there at the bench. The judge is the man, and he does not have a hat on, and he has a beard. And you'll notice that he's surrounded by 6 women. The women are all wearing hats. Now, here's what's going on here. The judge simply enjoys the company of young women. These women are all socialites. They're all debutantes. They're the daughters of wealthy families. And they have the privilege of coming to sit with him as he makes his judgments and hears these fantastic cases, like the case of the Haymarket 8. And while this judge is supposed to be listening to testimony, he flirts with these young girls. He likes to draw them pictures and pass them notes while he's doing his job. I guess it was very much a different day and age. I certainly hope something like this wouldn't happen today. It's for me just kind of very gross. So now, one of the women that was there, she actually was taken in by one of the defendants. And that defendant was August Spiess. August Spiess was a German immigrant. He was an anarchist and one of the advertisers for the Haymarket Square rally. And he passionately defended that he had been placed on trial, not because he had committed murder or done anything wrong, but he had been placed on trial for freely expressing his beliefs, which was protected under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. Yes, he was an anarchist, but no, you cannot place him on trial for believing in whatever it is he believes in or professing that belief. That was his right as an American. The name of the debutante, her name was Nina Van Zandt, and she fell in love with this man. Needless to say, this story became a headline sensation. Here is this wealthy rich girl who fell in love with a radical anarchist. Spiess goes to jail, he's awaiting execution, and Nina Van Zandt would come in to the jail to spend time with him. So, in both the case of Spiess and Parsons, they both had interesting love lives that are worth bringing into this story, just for some color. Now, of the 7 men that were condemned to death, 2 of them asked for clemency. Their sentences were reduced to life in prison. One of the men who was condemned to death, he committed suicide in prison, leaving us 4 left to die. And these 4 men were hung in the prison. 2 of these men were Albert Parsons and August Spiess. And we still never knew who threw the bomb. And let's remember that all this started at the McCormick Reaper Works, where all men wanted was an 8-hour workday. In the Waldheim Cemetery in Chicago, these 4 men were buried, and there is today a monument for them. And at the base of this monument is a quote from from August Spiess. It's what he said after he was told that he had been sentenced to death. Spiess proclaimed that the day will come when our silence will be more powerful than the voices that you throttle at us today. And that is the first of our 3 stories of the violent clash between labor and management in the late 19th century. For the second one, we shift our focus to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where we will talk about the Homestead Strike of the year 1892. Here is Pittsburgh in the late 19th century. If you are not familiar with Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh is located in one of the most perfect areas for river transport in the United States of America. It's easy to understand why there was a city established here in western Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh is located along the confluence of two rivers, the Allegheny, which flows from the north, and the Monongahela, which flows from the south. And these two rivers merge and they flow into the Ohio River. And so in the 19th century, especially in the early 19th century, when river traffic was the principal mode of transportation, why Pittsburgh would just be a great place to establish a city. And so if you look at this particular image here, you see, downtown Pittsburgh, which is located, at the tip of this peninsula here in between the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers. And as the city grew, pretty early on in American history, the city grew up along both sides of both of these rivers. Some of the famous sports complexes associated with Pittsburgh's sports teams, professional sports teams like the Pittsburgh Steelers, for example, they are located on the north or west side of the Allegheny River here. So it would be on your left-hand side in this picture. Those athletic fields obviously aren't there at the time of this drawing. Okay, but it's important to remember that in the 19th century, Pittsburgh was the hometown of Andrew Carnegie and where his steel mills were located. So if I could just situate you in this image here and direct your attention to approximately where Andrew Carnegie had his steelworks, look at the river there on the right-hand side of the screen. That's the Monongahela River. And Andrew Carnegie's steelworks, and in particular, his steel mill that I'm going to talk about today, the Homestead Mill, that would have been located on the south side of the Monongahela River. So that would be on the very right-hand side of this image. Now, where actually this steel mill would be way, way, way in the background. The Monongahela would curve a couple of times before you'd actually get to the Homestead steel mill. But where Carnegie Steel Mill was located would have looked very similar to what you see on the right-hand side of this picture, which is you have the river, you have industrial factories there on the right-hand side, and then there are all the barges that take materials and goods and produce like to and from those factories. Not produce, products, I should probably say. And the Homestead Steel Works further down the Monongahela, that's what it looked like. And that is, as we hear the story, this might be helpful to know. You've got the Monongahela, the factory right next to it, and barges that can take things to and from the factory. All right, so we've learned a lot about Andrew Carnegie over the course of the last lecture in particular. He made his millions in steel. He started off a poor boy immigrant who worked his way up. He was extraordinarily smart. He made his millions, but then he also gave millions away in many philanthropic endeavors. He created Carnegie Hall, Carnegie Mellon University. Most significantly, he had libraries built all across the United States of America. He wanted to give back to the American people. And when it came to the men that worked for him, he thought of himself as a very enlightened, compassionate man. So at the Homestead Steel Mill, he didn't just have a mill, he created a whole town. At Homestead, homes were built for the families of the men who worked at the plant. So you see here in this particular photograph, these nice 3-story houses, well, they're actually 2 and 3 stories houses, that are built right next to the steel mills. There were grocery stores there, there were churches there, there were schools there. And Andrew Carnegie thought of himself as this benevolent man, as this enlightened entrepreneur, this good titan of business, who not only created jobs, but took care of his men. After all, Andrew Carnegie was one of these guys early on in his life. But Andrew Carnegie is also a man under pressure. In order for his steel mills to be successful, he needs to continually get investments, and he needs to show his investors that they're going to get a good return on his investments. And he knows 2 things. 1, in order to make his steel mills more successful, he needs to cut costs. And the only way he can cut costs is by cutting wages. The other thing he knows is this. He doesn't have the heart to do it himself. Andrew Carnegie doesn't have the stomach. He doesn't have the constitution to cut wages. Andrew Carnegie had even gone so far as to allow for two labor unions to be formed at Homestead to negotiate their salaries. So how did Andrew Carnegie decide to handle this situation? Well, he decides to handle it by running away. Carnegie ran away to his ancestral homeland of Scotland. He literally just goes on vacation. He's not going to deal with this situation. But before he leaves, he hires somebody who he knows can handle the situation. He hires Henry Clay Frick to run the Homestead Steelworks. He hires Frick specifically because Frick is a jerk. He is a very tough, cruel man. He is, by all accounts of the day and age, a mean SOB, the type of guy who seems to get excited by inflicting pain and suffering onto other people. Carnegie hires Frick because Frick can do what Carnegie knows he can't. Frick will cut wages significantly, he will break the unions, he will force the men to a strike, and then he will defeat the strikers. The workers at the Homestead Steelworks knew that something was going to happen because, first of all, they knew that Carnegie was gone, that Frick was in charge, and then Frick starts building a fortress around the steelworks. This wall was 3 miles long and encircled the entire factory. The wall was 10 feet tall. It was capped with barbed wire. There were guard towers built on top of the wall. When this was constructed, it was very clear to the men that Frick was going to break the unions, force the men to go on strike, and then keep the men out with these walls and this guard tower. And that is exactly what happened. Once the wall was constructed, notices went up on the wall stating that unions were now illegal in Homestead, wages were going to be reduced. If you did not agree to these terms, you would not be employed at Homestead. The men tried to negotiate with Frick. No surprise here, Frick refuses to negotiate. And when the men don't agree to the terms, the lockout begins. So the men jokingly referred to, well, I'm not sure exactly how jokingly, but they referred to the fortress-like wall built around the factory as Fort Frick. And Frick had locked the men out. He shut down the factory. He's keeping the men out, waiting for them to come crawling back to him to beg for their jobs back under his conditions. So now if you're one of these working men in Homestead and you've been locked out of the factory and you're not getting paid and you don't have a job, you know the factory is going to need somebody who would work in the steel mills. So you know Frick is going to be trying to bring people in. Now here's where I need you to remember sort of where the Homestead Steelworks was situated relative to Pittsburgh. It's located along the Monongahela River. So if Frick has built this huge fortress around the factory and the men are surrounding the fortress, he's likely not going to bring the men in, or the scabs in, through the gates in the wall. The men who have been locked out correctly assume that the scabs are going to be brought in on barges on the river. So they start posting lookouts, waiting for these guys to arrive. And sure enough, they do. At night, under the cover of darkness, the barges roll in. Now, the barges just aren't carrying working men. The first barges are carrying hired guns. There was an organization in the 19th century called the Pinkerton Guards. The Pinkerton Guards were literally an army that you could hire for your own personal protection. There were more men in the Pinkerton Guards in 1892 than there were in the United States Army. This was a militia for hire, and Frick hired them. Their job was simply to come in and secure the path from the docks into the factory, and then to begin bringing in the workers who would take the jobs of the men who were on strike. By the way, at this point in time in history, in 1892, the Pinkerton Guards were illegal in Ohio. Our state legislature had banned the use of hiring this private militia for your own personal protection or use or whatever here. But in Pennsylvania, Pinkerton's legal. So here they came. Once again, under the cover of darkness, to clear a path for the scabs to go into the factory to take the job and to stop the former workers from disturbing this process. But when the Pinkertons rolled up, the alarm was sounded. Literally, there was a man who was on horseback who did a Paul Revere-like ride through Homestead saying, "The Pinkertons are coming, the Pinkertons are coming, the Pinkertons are coming." And it wasn't just the men who rushed out there to confront them, but their families too. So men, women, and children, armed, headed out to the docks to fire upon the Pinkertons, who in turn fired back. We have a pitched battle between men on strike, who'd actually been locked out of their factory, and these Pinkerton guards. The workers were able to get a drum full of flammable material, set it on fire, and roll it down the hill onto the barge to catch the barge on fire to get it to explode. When this happened, the Pinkertons held out white flags to surrender to the workers. By the time this happened, there was a crowd of over 5,000 people watching this battle, and they cheered the workers as the Pinkertons emerged, hands up, surrendering. When the Pinkertons surrendered, the workers formed a gauntlet 600 yards long that the Pinkertons had to walk through, of course getting punched and kicked and beaten and getting yelled at as they walked through the 600 yards. And this seemed to be an incredible victory for the workers. Here are the workers beating up a Pinkerton guard. Afterward, there was this celebratory mood. It was thought that Frick would give in. His little Pinkerton plan didn't work. He didn't get any scabs in. The workers at this point have taken over the factory. But when the workers go onto factory grounds, that was private property. So Frick then calls upon the governor of Pennsylvania. And the governor of Pennsylvania was forced to intercede. For him, this was an incredible disturbance. People had died. Workers were trying to take over a factory that doesn't belong to them. Some of them even talking about creating a type of workers' republic where the workers run the factory. And when that happened, the governor decided to intervene. He felt it was his job to enforce the law to protect private property. So, Frick had hired 300 Pinkerton guards. The governor of Pennsylvania sends in 8,500 Pennsylvania National Guardsmen. They go in. They clear out the grounds of the factory. They protect the factory. And they only will then let in those men who agree to work under the terms and conditions that Frick set down. And that was the Homestead Strike of 1892. A few things to think about with the Homestead Strike. What do you think of Andrew Carnegie? He intentionally left Frick in charge, giving Frick full authority to do whatever was necessary to run the Homestead Mill as efficiently as possible, knowing that this is what Frick was going to do. And then Carnegie runs away on vacation. When Carnegie was confronted by reporters while he's in Scotland, far, far away on vacation, about this situation, Andrew Carnegie simply says, "I'm not in charge of the Homestead Mill. Henry Clay Frick is. What's happening there is not my responsibility." So what do you think about Andrew Carnegie knowing that? The other thing to think about with the Homestead Strike is the use of the Pennsylvania National Guard. The state government had to make a decision for how to deal with this situation, and the governor sided with Frick. Now the governor would say he is protecting private property, and he is. Henry Clay Frick had done absolutely nothing illegal. He had not broken any laws at this time. He was a tough businessman making these tough business decisions so that Homestead could make as much money as possible. He was willing to do what was necessary, what Carnegie didn't have the stomach to do. But his plan that he set into motion failed, and the men came into the factory and tried to take over the factory. The men were the one at that point in time, even if they felt that they were morally right, they were breaking the law. They were on private property. forcing the government to intervene and intervening on the side of management. Frick wins. But even though Frick didn't do anything illegal, and even though Frick wins, there's this strong sense among the people that the whole system is rigged, that government is working hand in hand with a wealthy industrialist, and it's the workers that get screwed. So you can see how there was a lot of anger among the working class. There was a sense of desperation, and this is why some of them start turning to things like anarchism. In the months that followed the Homestead strike, an anarchist dressed up like just another businessman was able to infiltrate the corporate offices of Carnegie Steel, find Frick, pull out a gun, and shoot him. But the shot only wounded Frick. It didn't kill him. For the third and last conflict between labor and management in the late 19th century, we shift our attention away from Pittsburgh and we go back to Chicago, Illinois, and the entire United States of America, because this is a strike that will start in one city, but then it'll spread across the entire nation. This is the Pullman strike, and the Pullman strike I have written here is starting in Chicago, Illinois, and it did. I mean, where it started is today technically Chicago, Illinois, but back then it was a suburb of Chicago called Pullman, Illinois. Pullman, Illinois was its own town that was established by a man named George Pullman. George Pullman was a multimillionaire who made his millions in designing very luxurious cars for trains. The Pullman Sleeper, as they were sometimes called. I can't say I've ever personally been inside a Pullman, but they look pretty nice. There are a few of them that are still around that are on display. But I do think if I was traveling around in the late 19th century and I was on a train, I think being in a Pullman car looks pretty nice. I sure wouldn't mind traveling like this. Or like this. Whenever I see the interior of these Pullman cars, I'm always very impressed with the woodwork. That would be traveling in style. All right, so Pullman. Very similar to Andrew Carnegie, really thought of himself as an enlightened industrialist. He builds these nice train cars for luxury travel, and they are constructed here in Pullman, Illinois. Today, it's part of Chicago, and it's still around today. It still has a quaint 19th century feel to it. In Pullman, Illinois, there were gardens, there were parks, there were churches, there were grocery stores, there were schools. George Pullman provided all of these things for his workers. There was a whole town for people to live in Pullman. And I think Pullman was very similar to Andrew Carnegie. I mean, he really thought of himself as this good guy. I'm providing jobs, I'm providing an incredible product, I'm creating a town. I'm not just providing a job, I'm actually taking care of people. You work for me, life is good. You get the job, you get the home, you get the town, you get the grocery store, you get the church, you get the school, you get the parks. All the Pullman families can play together. It's a nice setup. And of course it works for him too, because if he runs the factory and he owns the town, also his workers get paid, and then they take that money home and they pay for their rent, and that money goes back to George Pullman. So it took a lot of capital to create a town and factory and this whole setup, but it works out in the end for him. He's continually making a lot of money, and he enjoys this image of himself being a great benefactor. Okay, but then 1893. In the year 1893, there's a panic on Wall Street. Stock market crashes. And this crash has a lot to do with the railroad industry overextending itself. When the stock market crashes, unemployment soars throughout 1893 to 20%. 1 in 5 families do not have an income. And the railroad industry is hardest hit. So when the 1893 stock market crashes and railroad companies start going bankrupt, Pullman's sales sink to nearly nothing. If you're George Pullman, how do you respond to this? Well, he first lays off hundreds of employees. And of those that are left, he slashes their wages. When 1894 rolls around, George Pullman is paying his men $1 a week. How much was $1 a week in 1894? It's the equivalent of approximately $31 today. Could you live off of $31 a week? Could you take care of a family for that amount? That's what the Pullman men were expected to do. Now you think you were going to cut wages that much and you own the homes where the men are living, and you also own the grocery stores where the men are shopping for food, that you would drop the price of rent or the price of food. Well, he didn't do that. He kept all of those prices the same. These men and their families have nothing. The men were increasingly placed in a situation where they almost had to go on strike. But you don't go on strike first. The first thing you do is try to negotiate. And so the workers reached out to Pullman to begin the negotiation process, and Pullman refused to negotiate. Now, here's where we get a little insight into the mind of both George Pullman and Andrew Carnegie. They were similar in this way. Both of these men wanted to be seen as these benevolent capitalists, rich guys who really wanted to take care of their workers. But when times got hard, they refused to negotiate. They refused to talk to the labor unions. George Pullman in particular, he just didn't like that situation. He didn't like having terms being dictated to him. Here's what we'll work for. He wanted to be seen as this benevolent capitalist by creating this situation where he provides all the stuff for his workers. He doesn't like it when they come begging to him for more, or trying to negotiate with him, even during these incredibly hard times. So George Pullman refuses to negotiate. He just flat out refuses to talk. That becomes an important part of the story later. The fact that he forced men to go on strike. And so the strike is organized. Now, the Pullman strike was a big deal because Pullman cars are on every railroad across the United States of America. Now, the Pullman cars are made, they're manufactured in Pullman, Illinois, but they're being operated throughout the United States of America. And that too will become an important part of our story. So the men who were leading this strike in Pullman, Illinois, in order to win this strike, they decided to bring in some heavy guns. And by heavy guns, I mean this man. Eugene V. Debs was the president of the American Railway Union. This was a labor union for all railway workers. So Debs is a lot like Samuel Gompers in that he was a very important late 19th century organizer of labor unions. But Debs was different from Gompers. Gompers only wanted skilled labor to be in the AFL. Debs believed that skilled and unskilled labor should be cooperating and negotiating together. Debs was an interesting man. He was born to French immigrants in Terre Haute, Indiana. He dropped out of school at age 14 to help his family out, and he started working on a railroad. And so at a very young age, as a teenager, he became quickly acquainted with how tough life was for many of these men working on railroads. He did many things throughout his life. As a teenager, he also spent some time working as a fireman, and he took classes at night to continue his education. This picture that you see of Eugene V. Debs here, he's a little bit older. This would be a picture from the 20th century. At the time of the Pullman strike, he was in his early 40s, so a little bit younger than you see here. But Eugene V. Debs had this reputation as this great, inspirational speaker, this passionate negotiator. If there was anyone who could win the Pullman strike for the workers, it's Eugene V. Debs. So he comes into Pullman, Illinois, not only to inspire the workers there to strike until George Pullman sees the wisdom of negotiating, but because Pullman cars are all over the country, Eugene V. Debs encourages and inspires all the railway workers around the country who do anything with Pullman cars to join in the strike. And they do, largely, they do. This nearly grinds to a halt all railroad traffic in the United States in 1894. So one would think with railroad traffic not moving, the train simply not running, this would force George Pullman to negotiate with the workers. But things got complicated. First, things got complicated in terms of race. Here's an illustration of a porter working on a Pullman car delivering a box of cigars to two travelers. You see the Pullman factory in the background there. And you'll notice that the two travelers are white men and that the porter is an African American man. The porters on all of the Pullman sleeper cars were African American men. They were hired to serve and take care of probably the almost exclusively white clientele. So right away, as I describe this, you can probably pick up on the racial discrepancy here. So you've got white people who are traveling in these fancy cars and they're being served by black men. Now, when the Pullman strike happens and Eugene V. Debs inspires all of the workers across the United States of America, all the railroad workers across the United States of America, to boycott working on Pullman cars, Debs was highly successful with white people. But the African American porters on the Pullman cars refused to join in the strike. Now, why would the black men refuse to join in the strike? Well, this probably has a lot to do with the fact that they are black and they have jobs and there's a depression going on. I would assume what's going on in the minds of these black men is that striking is a privilege for white people. Now, granted, to go on strike is very dangerous. We saw this in Homestead and the McCormick Reaper Works prior to the Haymarket Square riot. It's dangerous for white people. It's probably extra dangerous for an African American man. And if you go on strike, chances are it'll be extremely difficult to get another job. And you might get hurt. There might be acts of violence against you. So for the African American men who were porters on the Pullman sleeper cars, they refused to go on strike. So what you now have then is a split between the workers for the Pullman company that go on strike and those that don't, and it's divided along racial lines. George Pullman responds to this in Pullman, Illinois, by attempting to hire more African Americans to go to work in his factories. He's hiring black men to be the scabs. You have the white men who are on strike, the white men who work for the Pullman company who are going on strike, and the Pullman's trying to bring in black men to replace them. This, hopefully you can understand, creates some horrible racial conflict. And Pullman was willing to use this racial conflict to divide the strikers, or divide the workers rather, because the more infighting you had among the workers, then the greater chance that the strike will fail. So now the Pullman strike went on for several months. It started in May of 1894. It won't end until July. That's a long time to have a great many trains not running. And so the President of the United States was pressured to get involved. So the President of the United States at the time in 1894 was President Grover Cleveland. He was a Democrat. As a president, he's kind of interesting in two ways. One, he's the only president to serve two non-sequential terms. So he was both our 22nd and 24th president. He was elected the first time in 1884 and the second time in 1892. He was also our only bachelor president, single when he came into the White House. Thomas Jefferson was single too, but he had been married before and his wife had passed away. So those make President Grover Cleveland an interesting president to study in American history. Now, in terms of his politics, he was a Democrat. And when it came to the Pullman strike, he was very torn. He was very, very torn. Before people came to him to help solve this crisis, they had gone to the governor of Illinois. They had asked the governor of Illinois to break the strike in a similar way that the governor of Pennsylvania had sent in the National Guard to Homestead. And the governor of Illinois wouldn't do it. His heart was with the workers. He thought that George Pullman was a jerk for not negotiating with the workers. So when it comes to Cleveland, when it comes to President Cleveland, he does not like the idea of sending in federal troops to essentially allow the scabs to go to work and put an end to the strike. For President Cleveland, he thought a lot about the founding principles of our country. He's like, this is what we fought against with the British. With the British, you had this big, strong central government with a powerful military that subjected people to its will. And he's like, that's what we fought against. He looked at the American Revolution as a populist movement. The people were standing up for their individual rights, and that's what he saw with the Pullman strike. So President Cleveland doesn't want to be like the British and send in the military forces to put down the people. So he believes that. But at the same time, he, like every other president in American history, wants the economy to do better. He knows that his administration will be judged based upon how well the economy is doing during his 4 years. You've got a depression going on, and you've got a railroad strike. This country seems to be shut down. People are suffering. He wants those railroads up and going. So President Grover Cleveland has several sleepless nights about trying to figure out how to handle this situation. How do you get these railroads up and going and at the same time not abuse federal authority? So what's he do? Well, in the end, here's what happened. Attached to some of the Pullman cars on the railroad lines were United States mail cars. So when the railroad strike happened, a great deal of the mail wasn't delivered, and it is, of course, a federal offense to interfere with the delivery of the mail. So President Grover Cleveland sends in the United States Army to liberate the trains. Now, the trains need workers, so that you as somebody on strike, you could either agree to go back to work under George Pullman's terms or continue to strike and let a scab take your place. Either way, the ultimate result is the United States Federal Army showed up to support George Pullman. The strikers responded with destruction. They destroyed property. They tried to blow up as many Pullman cars as possible. Some of the strikers will go to jail for acts of destruction and for their participation in the Pullman strike. The Supreme Court in 1894 actually had to rule on whether or not the president had abused his authority by sending in United States federal troops. Now, before Grover Cleveland sent in the troops, he did receive a court injunction that labeled the strike a conspiracy against free trade that interfered with the delivery of the mail. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Grover Cleveland, supporting that, yes, what the strikers were doing was illegal. Illegal in that, one, they interfered with the delivery of the mail, and two, this one is interesting, that they violated the Sherman Antitrust Act by creating a union of all railroad workers, and that therefore is a monopoly. And of course, monopolies are illegal under the Sherman Antitrust Act, and the court can break them up. So the Supreme Court, ruled in favor of using force to break up the strike. So once again, for many Americans in the 1890s, they're like, the government is for management and they're against labor. For most Americans, that's how they're feeling at this time, is that these big businessmen, these big powerful businessmen like Frick, Carnegie, Pullman, that they're sort of working in cahoots with the United States federal government. And there's this anger. When is the United States federal government going to support us? And that sentiment will come to arise 2 years later during the 1896 election. President Grover Cleveland, just because the Supreme Court ruled in his favor and supported him, didn't help him to feel any better about what he actually did. So he launched a federal investigation into George Pullman. And the purpose of this commission was to investigate to what degree Pullman created this national crisis. And this presidential commission determined that Pullman was responsible for starting the strike due to his complete unwillingness to negotiate. The commission also reported that labor unions are necessary to curb the unrestrained power of corporations. In response to this commission, George Pullman's charter for Pullman, Illinois, was revoked. So in other words, Pullman had his city taken away from him, and the city of Pullman, Illinois became absorbed into the greater Chicago metropolitan area. It's now just a neighborhood of Chicago. Pullman lost his city. The other thing President Cleveland did, because he felt bad for the laborers, is he gave them a national holiday, Labor Day. I don't know about you, but when I think about Labor Day, I usually think of, well, it's the end of the summer. Usually hang out with family, have a nice barbecue, and I think that's what most people do on Labor Day. But the next time you celebrate Labor Day, maybe think about all those railroad workers in Pullman, Illinois in 1894, who Pullman said, well, I'm only going to give you $1 a week, a wage you can't live off of. And thousands of railroad workers around the country rose up to have the right simply to talk with their bosses, to negotiate a fair salary. You could think about the country shutting down and a president who had to make a very difficult decision, a decision that would haunt him, but would ultimately give us Labor Day. Maybe you can remember to think of that, the first Monday of every September. And what happened to Eugene V. Debs? Well, the Pullman strike is the defining moment of this man's life. This guy pretty much shut down the whole country. He barnstormed around, speaking, inspiring people, getting the poor to rise up in their willingness to fight the man. Well, poor Eugene V. Debs is going to be placed on trial. He will be found guilty for violating the federal injunction to get the trains back up and moving. He tried to continue the strike, and so he's going to go to jail for 6 months. And those 6 months in jail have a profound effect on him, because while he's in jail, he gets radicalized. When he comes out of jail, he begins the process of forming the Socialist Party of the United States of America. He will run for president 5 times. Famously, when he runs for president in 1920, he runs for president from jail. He had been jailed for speaking out against America's entry into the First World War. As a socialist candidate for the presidency of the United States of America, he advocated for the federal government to have greater control over businesses and factories to protect the rights and the welfare of the workers. Eugene V. Debs is also the founder of an international labor organization called the IWW, the International Workers of the World. They were sometimes nicknamed the Wobblies. The IWW was an international labor organization that would take both skilled and unskilled laborers to unite in this giant labor union that would have incredible negotiating power, or at least ideally they were striving to have incredible negotiating power by getting everybody, essentially all workers, involved in this international union, so that if there was one factory where people were getting abused, poor working conditions, poor hours, or whatever, then all IWW workers would go on strike and shut down all factories across the country and even some around the world, really forcing management to negotiate with the workers. That is what the IWW strove to do. This is an interesting slide from the late 19th century. It's an interesting image from the late 19th century. And I think it really sums up Haymarket, Homestead, and Pullman. You see these 3 witches standing around a cauldron. The 3 witches are named trusts, money, power, and railroads. The cauldron is called Monopoly, and they're stirring it with some sort of ladle with a $ sign on top. And out of this brew comes socialism. This giant, brawny, tough guy of a spirit called socialism. And I think this is what a lot of people felt was happening when you get to the 1890s, at the very end of the 19th century, was there was the rich industrialists. They were so powerful, and labor was so weak. And whenever the government intervened, it seems like they almost always intervened on the side of management and broke the strikes. That just created so much anger among the masses, among the laboring class, the working class, that there was this desire for some sort of socialist reform, that the government must do more to protect the rights of the workers. And if we could go back to Samuel Gompers, this is what he was afraid of in the 1880s. This is why he believed so much in labor unions, and for labor unions to have the right to negotiate. If workers have the right, the legal right to join a labor union, and to engage in collective bargaining with their management, to come to a deal, to have a contract, then that stops the forces of radical socialism or even anarchism. It stabilizes society. But in the late 19th century, when we talk about Haymarket, Homestead, Pullman, none of these work out well for the working class. None of them. And a sense of desperation starts to sink in. And that desperation is revealed in the 1896 election. The two candidates for the presidency, they were, as you see here on the left, William McKinley from Canton, Ohio. He was the Republican candidate. The Democratic candidate for the president, we see here pictured on the right, this is William Jennings Bryan. He was from Kansas. Bryan believed in workers' rights. He believed in fair working conditions. He believed in taxing the rich. He believed in providing more federal support for both farmers and industrial workers in the city. McKinley's campaign was heavily financed by wealthy industrialists such as Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, who gave him thousands of dollars for his campaign. William McKinley famously campaigned by just giving speeches on his front porch at his home in Canton, Ohio, but he ran a smear campaign against Bryan. A lot of that money was used to pay journalists across the United States of America to write these scathing articles about Bryan and how Bryan will economically destroy the country. Bryan didn't have the money in his campaign to buy off journalists and to have other articles written in response. So what William Jennings Bryan did is a whistle-stop tour. And this is actually the first modern presidential campaign tour. When we think about presidents campaigning, we think of them going from, town to town to town, giving speeches, holding rallies. And it was really William Jennings Bryan who's the first presidential candidate to do that. And he did that because he didn't have the money to pay journalists to write articles in his favor. So he went from town to town to town on a train, giving speech after speech after speech after speech, denouncing William McKinley, telling the people that William McKinley is nothing but a puppet in the hands of the rich, who is only going to protect their interests. And then he says, I, William Jennings Bryan, will protect your interests, the interests of the working class, the farmer, and the factory worker. William Jennings Bryan, a country boy from Kansas himself, was a pretty inspirational speaker, but it wasn't enough. The 1896 election went to William McKinley. We will talk much more about William McKinley in future lectures. But for now, let's wrap up this lecture by moving into the 20th century and talk about one last entrepreneur and industrialist, a man who is very different from the previous entrepreneurs and industrialists. This is Henry Ford. You've likely heard of him. He founded the Ford Motor Company. Now, Henry Ford did not invent the car. He did not invent the car engine, although he certainly made some important improvements to it. Cars first came along in the 1880s in Germany, and they were very expensive novelty items. They were essentially toys for rich people. If you had a car in the late 19th century, if you were one of these super rich people who bought a car just because it was this interesting novelty item, this cool piece of technology, if you had one of these horseless carriages, as they were called, well, your car would have been handmade. Somebody or a group of people would have put it together piece by piece. You would personally have to have someplace to drive it because it's not like there were paved roads at this point in time in history. So you'd have your estate. You could drive it around the grounds a little bit, maybe drive it around the town to show it off and honk your horn and scare all the horses out of the way. Your car is going to break down frequently because the engines were very rudimentary, and so you're going to have to hire a mechanic, somebody who knows these things, to come over to fix your car. So you're going to have to have your own personal mechanic. So these things were a hassle. I mean, they're neat. Who doesn't want to see a carriage that can drive itself? It doesn't need to be pulled by a horse. That's a pretty neat piece of technology. But they're certainly not practical, and they're certainly not affordable. So they're toys for rich people, right? But then along comes Henry Ford. And Henry Ford's a visionary. In the same way that Carnegie was a visionary with steel, Rockefeller with oil, Thomas Edison with light and recorded music, or Steve Jobs with telecommunications. Henry Ford was a visionary. He's one of the few people who think that cars are going to be the wave of the future, that we can mass produce cars. We can produce cars so fast and so cheaply that nearly every family will be able to afford a car, and we will pave roads and connect towns. This will enable travel and shipping to be far more fast and efficient, and it will completely transform and improve American life, making him extraordinarily rich in the process. So Henry Ford is yet another example of a capitalist economy encouraging innovation. Now, Henry Ford's is a good story in that the early part of his life was one of failure after failure after failure. He was still in his late 30s while he was trying to create the Ford Motor Company. He was a good scientist and innovator. I mean, just very similar to Thomas Edison. He really worked hard to create a reliable engine. But he had trouble getting his car company started. And in fact, like one of his first endeavors in business when he was in his early 30s failed, and he ended up having to move back in with his parents in his 30s. And his dad thought he was a complete loser, not knowing what Henry Ford was going to do. But Henry Ford has this dream of making cars and making cars efficiently and quickly and cheaply so that the majority of people can afford to buy a car. But in order to do that, he needs investors. He needs capital. He needs people to believe in his dream. So in order to attract investors, he pulls a publicity stunt. He enters into a car race. Henry Ford builds a race car. He calls his race car Sweepstakes. It's got 2 cylinders, it's got 26 horsepower, it can go a top speed of 72 miles an hour. Not bad for 1901. Now there's a lot of luck in this particular story. Henry Ford was living in Detroit, Michigan at the time when it was announced that there was going to be a race, an automobile race, on a horse track, because there are no automobile tracks at the time, so on a horse track in nearby Grosse Pointe, Michigan, which is pretty much a suburb of Detroit. Now, this wasn't going to be a very big race, but it became a big race when America's first famous celebrity race car driver, a man by the name of Alexander Winton, agreed to participate in the race. And Winton was such a cocky jerk that he said, well, I'll agree to race if I can design the trophy, thinking that he was going to win it, assuming he was going to win it. Now, this race was scheduled to be 25 laps around this horse track, and I do not know exactly how long the lap was, if it was like a quarter mile, like a high school track is today. I don't know exactly what a lap was, but it was 25 laps around this track. So Ford, when building his race car Sweepstakes, he works on the engine so that it will be reliable and that it will last, knowing that most of the engines have problems and they sputter out. And so speed is obviously important, but reliability of that engine to last, that's going to be the most important thing. And so he works on perfecting his spark plugs. So when the day of the race happens, 8,000 spectators show up. It is an all-day event filled with races that last all day, leading up to the final event that'll happen in the evening. But when the evening finally rolls around, most of the cars at that point of time have broken down. And there's actually only 3 cars that are left. There's Henry Ford, there's Alexander Winton, and there's one other guy who doesn't matter. You've got only 3 competitors, and the crowd has dwindled down significantly too. The race directors decide to change the length of the final race. They said instead of doing 25 laps, we're going to reduce it to a 10-lap sprint. So that doesn't work out necessarily in Henry Ford's favor because he wants the longer race. He's built his car for endurance. But guess what? It works out in his favor. Alexander Winton, even though he had the faster car, these cars have been pushed so hard throughout the day that on the 7th lap, Winton's car starts to sputter. On the 8th lap, Henry Ford passes Alexander Winton, goes on to win the race, and much to Alexander Winton's disgrace, Henry Ford gets to take his trophy that he designed. This PR stunt of building a car and driving it faster than the greatest race car driver in the United States of America at the time makes Henry Ford a minor celebrity, and it gets him investors. And Henry Ford begins building his Ford automotive plants around Detroit, Michigan. Detroit will forevermore be associated with the automotive industry in the United States of America. It even gets the nickname of Motor City or Motown. But what is most important to know is how Henry Ford builds his cars. Now remember, Henry Ford, in order to make this new car available to the masses, he has to produce them in such a way that's cheap. He can't just have a group of individuals standing around, each of them building a car. So Henry Ford develops what is called assembly line production to achieve this goal of mass producing cars that are cheap enough that many people can buy them. Now, we've had mass production in the United States of America for a while. Andrew Carnegie, for example, was able to mass produce steel. But this is something different. It's mass production on an assembly line. So Henry Ford designs a plant where we start on one end of the plant with essentially the skeleton of the car, the chassis. And this basic frame of the car moves along a conveyor belt from room to room to room, where one group of people have one specialized task of assembling one part of the car. So the frame moves into one room where the axles go on, and then the next room where the wheels go on, another room where the seats go on, another room where the engine is lowered in, another room where the lights go on, the steering wheel goes on, and so on and so forth. And so as a worker in one of these Ford manufacturing facilities, you had one thing that you did over and over and over and over and over. You'd be working on the line, and here comes this car frame. And let's say you're putting on, I don't know, the headlights. And you would maybe have, let's say, a minute, to screw in the two front headlights and the two back headlights as this car frame is going down the line. And that's what you did all day. Now that may sound boring and repetitive, and it was, but it enabled Henry Ford to produce one car in 84 steps in 90 minutes. His first car that he was successfully able to mass produce like this, that had a relatively reliable engine, was this, the Model T. And the Model T Ford becomes an icon for American innovation and assembly line production. The Model T Ford was sold for $850. Now, that was expensive in the 19-teens. Not everybody could afford a Model T Ford, and Henry Ford continually worked on creating a car more efficiently so that it could be sold for cheaper so that more people could afford them. So $850 back in the 19-teens would be about the equivalent of $12,000 today. Again, not everybody today would have an additional $12,000 to go and buy something with. Now, today, if a car was being sold for $12,000, probably would be very popular because cars are more popular today, cars are more needed today, but still $12,000 is within the reach of a lot of families. And so, this being $850 back then, a great deal of families started to buy the Model T Ford. And this begins to transform American culture. Cars are going to replace horses and carriages. Roads are going to go up all over the United States of America. Eventually, we'll need highways, which will come around in the late 19-teens for the first time. And then eventually interstates, which will come around in the 1950s. A whole new culture will spring up then in the late 20th century of hotels and fast food chains. All of this because of the mass production of the car. Now, let me go back to the workers for Henry Ford for a moment. These jobs might sound rather tedious and boring and even mind-numbing. I mean, if I'm going to spend all day putting a wheel on an axle and screwing it in, and that's my job, and just repeat, it sounds like it's enough to drive you insane. But here's what Henry Ford did. Henry Ford limited his workday to an 8-hour day, 40 hours a week. If you worked for Henry Ford, you got a weekend. Henry Ford's taking care of his workers a lot better than guys like George Pullman or Andrew Carnegie. You work for Henry Ford, you get paid $70. If you work for Henry Ford, you get paid $5 a day. That's today's equivalent of $70 a day, which, if you can save your money over the course of a few years, enables you to be within reach of purchasing one of these Model T Fords. That was amazing and so very different from the experience of working in any other factory at the time. If you're in one of Carnegie's steel mills, you're making the steel, but it's not like you have any other investment personally with the steel. What do you care about the steel? It gets sold off to somebody else. If you're building a Pullman car, it's not like you get to ride in the Pullman car. You're a lowly worker. But now Ford is having people create a product that they themselves might be able to enjoy. And that is transformative. Now, Henry Ford is also, he's not only one of the great innovators and entrepreneurs of American history who completely transformed American culture, he is also a highly controversial figure in American history because although he was personally socially progressive in terms of who he hired, Henry Ford hired African American men. Henry Ford hired white women to work at his plants in Detroit, Michigan. So he was arguably socially progressive in those ways. He was also passionately anti-Semitic. Henry Ford hated Jewish people. He even supported a newspaper that warned of an international Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. In this way, Henry Ford was an incredible racist. When the 1930s rolled around and Adolf Hitler, the anti-Semitic dictator who took over Germany, came to power, Henry Ford became friends with Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler expressed his admiration for the assembly line production facilities that Ford had created and said that he wanted to create Nazi Germany after the same model, where everybody has a role, everybody plays a part to create a strong, powerful country. And Adolf Hitler had a portrait of Henry Ford on his desk in Berlin. So Henry Ford, like so many people we talk about in American history, has a lot of good and a lot of bad associated with him. If we can go back to the good, Henry Ford's assembly line production influences nearly every industry in the United States of America. They just begin copying this method of mass producing things so that they can be sold cheaply and to the masses. So, for example, a guy by the name of William Wrigley in Chicago begins mass producing chewing gum. So here we have chewing gum, again, once a novelty item like the car sort of, becomes mass produced and really cheap, and now all of a sudden everybody's chewing gum in the 20th century. In Pennsylvania, a man by the name of Milton Hershey begins mass producing chocolate candies. And Milton Hershey, a little bit like George Pullman, has a whole town next to his factory, both of which are named after him, along with all of his candies. Hershey's Kisses and Hershey's Milk Chocolate Bars. Motorcycles, again a novelty item, now mass produced by the Harley-Davidson Motorcycle Company, can be purchased and enjoyed by anybody who wants one. And today, everything, well, maybe not everything, but so many things, from crayons to refrigerators, are mass produced on assembly lines so that so many people can afford them. Now, this picture that you're looking at here was actually taken in Ohio, where Frigidaire refrigerators were once made. Now, this picture is old because beginning in the 1970s, the jobs once held by people on assembly lines were increasingly replaced by robots. Robots were cheaper to maintain, they could work 24 hours a day, they didn't require healthcare packages, they didn't take bathroom breaks, and as computerization got better, the robots were more accurate. They built better products. And because of this computerization, the city of Detroit, Michigan will suffer significantly in the 1980s, 90s, and into the early 2000s. Detroit today is really only now making its comeback. This mass production on assembly lines plays a very important role for the United States of America in the 20th century, especially when it comes to the two world wars, because we have so many production facilities. When World War I and then especially when World War II comes around, we can transform these facilities from producing things like refrigerators and cars to producing things like machine guns and bombers. One thing we will learn about when we study World War II is how our ability to mass produce things in assembly line production, as taught to us by Henry Ford, enables us to win World War II. Think of it like this. The United States of America is going to fight the Empire of Japan. Both countries are going to have planes. Both countries are going to get their planes shot out of the sky. A simple way to think of this war is like this. Whichever country can replace those planes the fastest wins the war. Now, obviously, it's not just planes. It's going to be planes and boats and jeeps and guns and all of that. But whoever can mass produce the fastest wins. That's one way of looking at World War II. Well, the United States of America mass produced the fastest. And that's all thanks to the innovation of one Mr. Henry Ford, who started the Ford Motor Company in Detroit, Michigan in the early 2000s. And this, United States history students, ends part 2 of our very long unit on the industrial era of the late 19th century. I hope you enjoyed some of this. I hope you learned a lot. Thank you so much for paying attention. I shall see you in class.